Okay, great. Good morning, everyone. I'm Mary Jones. I serve as chair for the Kansas Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board. I ask the following members of the board to respond to roll call to signify their presence at this open meeting that's being conducted remotely by conference call or other electronic medium. Dave Anderson.
Present.
Jill Flessing.
Present.
Linda Heitzman Powell.
Present.
Donna Honer-Quall. Jim Kilmartin.
Here.
Jacqueline Lightcap.
Here.
Richard Nobles.
Here.
Andrea Perdomo Morales.
Present.
Cynthia Shandell.
Present.
Laura O'Shaughnessy.
Present.
And David Stevens.
Here.
I note the following staff members are also present: David Fye.
Here.
Leslie Allen.
Here.
Cindy Durkle.
Here.
Tyler Wadsworth. Tim Resner, serving as legal counsel for the board, is also present. And next, David Fye will read a message regarding this meeting being held remotely.
This is David Fye, Executive Director for the Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board. Public comment allows the public to address the board about its concerns, but the Kansas Open Meeting Act, or KOMA, does not require the board to provide public comment or answer questions from individuals. Individuals requesting to provide public comment could contact the executive director prior to the meeting by sending an email to david.fye@ks.gov. There will be no time for public comment to allow sufficient time for the board to discuss all items on the agenda. Because we are conducting this public meeting remotely, I state for the record the following information. Access to this meeting is being conducted by a medium of interactive communication that allows members of the public without cost to attend the meeting through the use of the conference call or by viewing the board's YouTube channel. While the meeting is conducted remotely, the requirements of KOMA are not suspended. As such, we will be conducting this meeting pursuant to KOMA. On August 30th, 2023, we sent notice of the board meeting to all individuals who had requested notice of board meetings. The notice was also posted on the board's website, ksbsrb.ks.gov. You may obtain a copy of the notice at that website. An agenda and other media material have been posted on the board's website and are available for review. You may also request a copy of the agenda specifically by sending an email to david.fye@ks.gov with the subject line request for the agenda, and it will be sent to you. The notice contains information for the conference call and the YouTube channel that allows the public to attend the meeting free of charge. The notice also states that if we have any technical issues during the meeting, you may send an email to bsrb@ks.gov. A recording of the meeting will be available on the BSRB YouTube channel following the conclusion of the meeting by using a link to the meeting on the agenda. And the conference call line is active. I checked it before we started. There was no one on the call, but I'll let you know if someone beeps on.
Great, thank you very much. Our first item this morning is agenda approval. I think there was a separate email sent. Was that this morning with the July?
There was an email sent on Friday with most of the materials, and then there were some minutes from the previous meeting that were sent this morning. So
okay, thank you so much. So the first thing we need to do on this is approve the agenda. Are there any changes on the agenda before we get into next items? Okay, can I get a motion to approve? Thank you very much, Jim. Second.
Second.
Thank you. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye. Aye.
Any
Aye.
opposed, same sign. Okay, thank you very much. The next item of business is to welcome new board member Jill Flessing. She is for the board member for the addiction counseling. Jill, if you'd like to talk a little bit about yourself or introduce yourself to the board, we'd love to hear from you.
Good morning. Thank you. My name is Jill Flessing. I am a clinical social worker, clinical addictions counselor who I have lived in Kansas since 1997. I earned my MSW at Washburn in 2006 and started my professional career in community mental health in Jefferson County, Kansas.
Oh.
Then I worked developing a mental health and treatment program at a safety net clinic here in Lawrence for uninsured and underserved Douglas County residents. And now I work at counseling and psychological services at the University of Kansas. That's my professional background. I'm glad to be here. Thank you so much.
Thank you. We're glad to have you. The next item was public comment, of which we have none. And so we will now get to the review and approval of the minutes from the July 10th meeting.
So moved.
Thank you, Dave. And second,
I'll second.
thank you very much. All those in favor, please say aye.
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 Any opposed, same sign. Great, David, we'll give it to you for your director's report.
Thank you, Mary. In my report, you have a list of some operations updates, some legislative information, and then a few other updates. So I'll go ahead and start with operations. One item that I like to mention when we have the full board meetings is just a reminder, all of our meetings are broadcast on our YouTube channel, and we started that practice back in January of 2021 as a way to provide more accessibility to our meetings and also do them in a secure way. Since that time, we have now broadcast or uploaded afterwards about 126 or more meetings. Those have been viewed about 4,580 times. So impressive numbers, and just a good reminder about all the different information we're putting out there, and people have been providing a lot of receptive comments to me. They appreciate the information being shared and having a better way to understand some of the discussions taking place and some of the news that we're putting out there. In terms of another item, in terms of outreach, Leslie Allen and I routinely each year try to set up meetings with certain schools. That's usually upon request of the school and our availability to speak to groups of students and talk to them a little bit about the licensing process, answer their questions, talk about some disciplinary items ahead of them becoming licensed so that they have a general understanding of some of those types of things, and then just talking to them about the role that BSRB plays and some of the resources we can provide to them, and some of the ways that our staff can assist them as they go to become licensed professionals. And so we have started to receive requests. We've started to put those on the calendar, and some of those we're going to try to do in person based on locations of schools and availability. Some of those are going to be by Zoom, but we're looking forward to talking to students currently and future professionals as we help them understand a little bit more about these professions they're going to be entering. Additionally, we have been working on budgetary items. Every year, state agencies are required to submit a budget, and these are turned into the Division of Budget by September 15th each year, and so that is Friday of this week. And so that is one of the roles that I perform on behalf of the agency. And so last year, the legislature approved an expenditure limitation for us for fiscal years 2023, 2024, and 2025. And so we just ended fiscal year 2023 at the end of June. And what we will be doing this time is submitting revised estimates of projections and revenue and expenditures for fiscal year 2024, which is what we're currently in, and then also fiscal year 2025. Last meeting, I talked a little bit about end of the year revenue and expenditures. And so just to kind of start from that point, our revenue last fiscal year was $772,000 is what we had projected. The amount that actually came in was $868,000. We were right on projection until the last month of the fiscal year, and we had a significant amount of people who applied for licensure in June. And so aside from that, we would have been pretty close to projection. But this fiscal year, when we submitted the budget last year, we submitted an estimate of revenue of about $915,000. And basically every other year, based on our 2-year licensure cycle, we anticipate having a year of higher revenue, followed by a year of lower revenue. And so this would be a year of higher revenue. Based on the first couple of months of this fiscal year, it looks like it's a little bit lower than it came in last year. So I'm not sure if I'll revise that estimate above what it was submitted last year. There's also a few things that are in the mix that I think I might have mentioned last time. There is a compact for psychologists that was passed a couple of years ago called SIPAC. And under that, individuals from other states that would like to practice in Kansas to do telehealth are able to do so under authority of the SIPAC Commission if they apply and are approved for that. And so that's an alternative to our licensure. And we did see some individuals not renew their license when that compact was passed. We recently joined a professional counseling compact. that is a new compact. It's for individuals at the clinical level of professional counseling. And that professional counseling compact is a really new compact, and it's not yet operational. But once it is fully going, individuals would be able to apply to the Compact Commission for a privilege to practice in Kansas. And that could be in lieu of having a license in Kansas. And so we expect to see some change in the number of individuals who are licensed as professional counselors because of that compact. And then there's also a new social work compact that I will talk about a little bit later too. And that compact is set up with a multi-state license model. And so states that join that social work compact would be able to issue a multi-state license as well as a single state license. And so individuals who live in other states who currently get the Kansas license, if the compact becomes operational for social work, they would have the option of purchasing a multi-state license from their state instead of purchasing the Kansas license if they wish to practice in Kansas. So that's still a little ways away. The social work compact has only passed in one state so far. That's Missouri. The language for that recently got finalized at the beginning of March of this year. So, but the reason I mentioned some of these things is when we're looking at revenue projections, taking into account changes in licensure are really important, because we have not just the individuals who live here in the state of Kansas based on telehealth and the nature of the profession. There are individuals from other states that are able to practice in Kansas, or perhaps maybe they live in another state, but they travel to Kansas and practice here some of the year. And so that traditional model of being licensed could be replaced by one of these new formats for the multi-state compact. So there's a little bit of uncertainty as these are being put into place. In the next few years, we should have more certainty, but we may not revise our revenue estimate too much based on the level of uncertainty that's currently out there. In terms of our expenditures, the amount that we were approved to spend for this current fiscal year last year was $1,173,000. Part of the reason we were approved to spend that amount is upon the passage of the bill, Senate Bill 131, we received authority to hire 2 new employees. And so our operating expenditures were going to be going up by that, by a certain amount because of those new employees. Additionally, we are a small agency with one fund versus much larger agencies that have many different funds. We have to figure out different expenditures for all of our operating processes. Some of that includes potential legal fees. When we have license decisions, individuals have the opportunity to request a hearing on those, and then they have the opportunity to have those move forward. And if those go to certain levels, they can become expensive in terms of facilitating those types of hearings. The same thing in terms of disciplinary procedures. If the board, through the Complaint Review Committee, issues a disciplinary decision and that is appealed, that can be appealed to different levels. And so the reason I bring that up is because we budget in case we need to spend money for those purposes. And if we don't have to, it stays in the fund. But we have to make sure that we have those expenditures budgeted in case we need to use them, because if we under budget, then we could come into a situation where we approach the end of the fiscal year and we don't have enough authority to make those expenditures. So the budget for this next year, or this current year, we were approved to spend $1,173,000. On Friday of this week, I'll have to submit a new budget estimate. And so I will let you know if that's going to be higher or lower. We're right now in the process of weighing different items, looking at the cost indices that have changed in terms of the different fringe benefit costs for salaries, different amounts that we're paying for contractual services for other items. So I'll have more information for you at the next meeting in terms of the budget to be submitted. But we already have an approved budget. And so this is really just adjustments to the approved budget. One thing I will mention that's kind of an odd quirk in the budget process. So last year, the legislature approved a pay increase for all state employees, with some carve-out exceptions, but the majority of state employees received a 5% increase in pay. And that was beginning this fiscal year. And so most state agencies are only required to submit revisions to the current year budget and then one budget year. but for small agencies, they are sometimes referred to as biennial agencies. And so fee agencies such as the BSRB, and there's about 20 of those agencies, they are required every other year to submit a budget for 2 budget years. And that creates some weird complications at times, because the majority of the agencies only submit 1 future budget year, whereas we submit 2. And so the reason I frame it that way, the legislature approved the salary increase for all state employees, but as a technical adjustment, they only put it in for fiscal year 2024, not for fiscal year 2025. And so this was not intended as a 1-year bonus. It was intended to be something that would be continuing. And for the non-biennial agencies, it will just become part of their base and they will just move forward with that. However, for us to make sure that we continue to provide that to the employees for the next fiscal year, we will have to ask for something called a supplemental. And that is basically increasing our expenditure limitation by the amount of that increase for fiscal year 2025. So it's going to look like we're asking for more money. We're really not. We're really trying to correct, you could call it an error, you could call it something different, but basically the way that it was put in was only for 1 year when it really should have been put in for 2 years to stay consistent. And so that's one of the items we'll have put in there. But aside from that, I don't anticipate any kind of other increases in terms of our expenditure limitation. There will be some shifts between category of expenditure, but I don't foresee us needing to spend a lot of money above what we were approved to spend. And as I mentioned, I can provide more information on the general budget if you have questions, but that will be submitted this Friday, and then I can answer any further questions once we have solid numbers on that budget. Concerning some other items, last time I mentioned a little bit about information technology changes for the agency. That is something we take very seriously here at the BSRB. And we began a process 3 years ago in terms of replacing some of our technology, making it on a rotating basis so that some staff members would be shifting to new computers and then others the following year. And so we're in the process of getting some additional technology for staff members. At the same time, we have 2 new employees that we'll be putting into the mix. So we're getting some new technology for them as well. So those computers have been ordered and we're just waiting to receive those. And then in terms of some staffing updates, as I mentioned, we received authority to hire 2 new employees. To make that happen, we wrote up position descriptions for those employees, did advertising for those positions, and we opened it up to not only outside individuals, but also individuals currently working for the BSRB. And I'm happy to report that after interviewing all candidates, we selected 2 individuals who currently work at the BSRB that were in more entry-level positions or lower-level positions, that those individuals wanted to challenge themselves and take on more responsibility. And so we were happy to consider them for that, and then they will become the 2 new licensing specialist positions. However, in doing that, while there are certain benefits, it meant that those positions now became open. And so we had to advertise for a renewal specialist and also a clerical position. And so we went through that process, advertised that, did interviews, and happy to report that we have brought 1 employee on for our renewal specialist position. That was about a week or 2 ago. And then the last position, the clerical position, we made a decision on that, but to allow enough time for IT to set up that user account and all the technical information that is needed to take place. That person will be starting next Monday, September 18th. So after that point, we will have all 12 employees in place. Over the last, I think, year and a half, we will have grown the agency from 9 employees to 12 employees. And so there are some adjustments with increasing the size of the BSRB. We have mentioned earlier, we've had to get creative in terms of space, in terms of where those individuals can physically set up. And so we are working on that. We're exploring some options. Currently, we have 1 member temporarily set up in the boardroom. The other individual, we're going to be using a sort of a shared space model with some remote work to make sure that we have a good plan in place for the immediate future. We are still working on having our current license files taken to the Historical Society. I mentioned at the last meeting, we were pursuing a change to our document retention schedule. We had previously had a schedule that said we would have to hold the files for all applicants and licensees up to expiration plus 10 years, and then move them to archives for the Historical Society. We got approval to shorten that length of time. And so that time is now expiration plus 2 years. And if we need the information, we can still request it, but this will mean we will be keeping less paper files at the BSRB office. And so we're in the process of moving those, working with partners at the Historical Society to make sure we have the boxes and that those can be picked up. Once we can move those, the goal is for us to be able to utilize a current area that we're using for files here in the office. And if we can utilize that for staffing instead, that's really the long-term home for the 2 new employees after we make some other adjustments here in the office. So a lot of technical things to work out, but we are, I think, on course and moving forward. We're also looking at the different responsibilities for staff members to make sure that we're meeting the new statutory deadlines and the new timeframes that were put into that bill. So I just want to give you an idea about those things that we've been moving forward on, and then those logistics. In terms of some legislative updates, I'll go ahead and talk a little bit about the major significant bill that passed last session that affects the BSRB 2023 sub for Senate Bill 131. You may recall that the origin of that bill was that it was a bill requested by the BSRB on behalf of recommendations made by the board, and the bill was a very large bill. It included some statutory cleanup and a lot of different changes. As that bill went through the process, there were some other modifications, and ultimately the bill did pass, and we have been working on moving forward with as many items as we could initially, and then doing sort of a second wave of implementing some of those items. So I thought it might be helpful for the board, and since we have some new members as well, I thought it might be helpful just to kind of go through those items that were in the bill that we have already implemented, and then some that we're moving forward on as well. So you have kind of an idea about the time frame for those items. So one of the items that was in the bill had to do with the temporary licenses for, I believe, 4 of the professions. So under most of the professions, when you apply for licensure, for initial licensure, you are trying to get approval to be able to take the license examination, because that is a requirement for you to get a permanent license. And so if you meet that criteria, you can get approved for a temporary license, which will allow you to practice under certain supervision, meeting certain requirements, but you can practice under that temporary license while you are taking the licensing examination and attempting to pass it. And for 2 of the professions, the temporary licenses had lasted 2 years. For the other 4, they had lasted for 1 year. And so one of the changes in the bill was to, as of July 1st, we could issue temporary licenses for all 6 of those professions for 2 years. And so we couldn't extend the ones that were already issued, but we could issue new temporary licenses that would last 2 years. And that would provide more security for those individuals. It would also provide some flexibility in case they had something come up, such as their own health or someone close to them that might have delayed their ability to schedule to take the test. Or if they didn't pass on the first attempt, it would allow them to work longer while they're trying to take the test on another effort. So that has been put into place. Those new temporary licenses are 2 years, and we've received a lot of positive comments for that. For the individuals who already had temporary licenses, there is some language that says under extenuating circumstances, they are able to get an extension of their temporary license up to 6 months. It does require an extreme situation and conditions outside of their control, but they can make a request for those. And so I've had a few people reach out to me who've asked if their temporary license could just have an extra year added. And I said, well, I can't do that. But I asked them if there were certain reasons why, they would need an extension as long as it met those requirements. And they've been able to provide information to me. So on a number of those individuals, I've been able to grant up to 6 months, which is the max we can grant for those individuals who already had a temporary license. And so they've been a lot of positive comments for that, and trying to help people as much as we can until we get to a certain situation where most of the people out there are under these new 2-year temporary licenses. Additionally, another change that we've moved forward on has to do with reciprocity for most professions. So for individuals applying for licensure and most individuals applying for reciprocity, the previous language had stated that someone needed to practice in their jurisdiction for, I believe, 48 of the last 54 months. But there was a bill that passed a couple of years ago that decreased the amount of time for reciprocity for military members, military spouses, individuals that reside in Kansas and those that intend to reside in Kansas. And it created a little bit of confusion between the two timeframes. And we've seen some other states have some shorter periods of reciprocity and some requests from individuals to look at the reciprocity requirements. The board had a really good discussion on that last year and recommended statutory language to shorten that length of time down to 12 months. And someone would have to hold a license with a similar scope of practice. But as long as they did that, that would allow them to become licensed through reciprocity in a much shorter period of time. So we've been able to move forward on that, and that's been very positively received as well. Additionally, we have created a new item that was put into the bill, which allows individuals who are coming to the end of their license period, who have not completed their continuing education hours. They have now an option in statute that they can request additional time to complete their hours if there was an extreme situation that prevented them from completing it. So we talked a little bit about this. The licensed psychologist previously had something specific to their profession that allowed these types of requests. But now the other professions have language in the statute that says, if you are coming to the end of your license period, you have not completed all of your CE hours, under extenuating circumstances, you could be approved for additional time. That length of time is up to 3 months. They could not use it in back-to-back license periods, but it does provide some flexibility. So if individuals are faced with a choice, knowing that something extreme has happened and they're trying to decide, should I let my license expire or should I use this to stay as a licensed professional? Now there's an option for them to stay licensed. And so really happy to set that up and looking forward to making more individuals aware of that so that they know that they can request that should they be in that situation. So that has been implemented as well. Additionally, for the behavior analyst profession, there was a change to statute that allowed some greater flexibility with disciplinary remedies. When that group was originally set up in statute, the language was not similar to the other professions. And so the language on disciplinary remedies basically said the options the board had authority to do were to suspend the license or revoke the license, but lesser penalties such as a small fine or a public censure were just missing from that section of the statute. So now that section of the statute is more consistent. And so the disciplinary remedies for the profession can be more consistent with the other professions. Additionally, there was a change to the licensed psychologist profession, and that was one of the requirements for licensure. The previous language called for good moral character, but the other professions within the BSRB called for someone to merit the public trust. And in looking at the other states, good moral character is kind of a standard that has been replaced by meriting the public trust. And so that is now changed. And so that is a new modification. And so I think that puts us more in line with other states and also the other professions. Additionally, there were some changes for individuals seeking to meet the requirements to become a licensed specialist clinical social worker. We have worked with Joan and Leslie. Joan is our licensing specialist who handles all of the clinical applicants for licensure. And so we have modified the forms for the changes that were put into place concerning the clinical social worker changes. And so those have been put into place. And so there's no delay in that implementation. Additionally, for individuals who are seeking to reinstate a license, one of the things we brought to you last time with the temporary regulations was the bill sets the floor for certain fees, and we need regulations to set the specific amount for those fees under the caps. And so one of the items in the bill had to do with individuals who wish to reinstate a license if they've been out of the profession for over a year. And so for individuals who do meet that criteria, if they wish to have their license reinstated, the cost for those individuals would be half the cost. And so that's another item that should help individuals come back to the profession as a way of growing the workforce for individuals who had let their license expire for one reason or another who are wanting to come back. And then in terms of some other items that have been recent changes, so for these items that I've already discussed, those were all put into place prior to, well, as of July 1st. Basically, the effective date of the bill mentions upon publication in the statute book. Generally, that's referred to as July 1st, although I know that they're still working on publishing the supplements and working on that behind the scenes, but we wanted to put these things forward as quickly as possible. So we did put out a message to all licensees prior to July 1st, letting them know about those items, and then also indicating there would be future items the agency would be rolling out as well. And I believe on August 18th, we posted a message on the BSRB website about 3 other items that the agency was able to implement as well. One of those has to do with a new student temporary addiction counselor license. This was an item originally recommended by the Addiction Counseling Advisory Committee. It is a first student temporary license that the BSRB has had, at least in the time that I have been here, but it is a way to help create a pipeline for individuals to join the profession. These would be for individuals who had a certain number of hours towards a addiction counseling degree, but would be able to work under certain conditions at certain locations under supervision while they're finishing their hours with an agreement with the school and with the employer. And so we're excited about now being able to offer those new student addiction counselor licenses. Additionally, there is a new temporary candidacy bachelor's and master's social work license. Last couple of years, we have talked about one of the issues for new social work programs, and that to become accredited by their national accrediting body, the Council for Social Work Education, CSWE, that process can take 3 to 3.5 years. And so our statutes basically say to look at the applicant. Did they come from a program that's accredited by CSWE? If not, they need to meet certain requirements and regulation. And so for new programs that are online only, they would not be accredited if they're still seeking that accreditation. And then they would have difficulty meeting the regulations because some of those call for, currently they call for certain hours to be attained while you are physically present at the school. And so, and there's other requirements as well. But we've seen some other states like Minnesota that have developed a model like this, which allows them to consider candidates who are in candidacy for accreditation, that basically you can award them a temporary license if they pass their licensing examination, and it can be renewed for another time period. And essentially, once their school becomes fully accredited, then they can get a permanent license. But it creates kind of a bridge to help with those individuals who apply from those programs while they are still seeking accreditation. Additionally, another new item that we have been able to implement has to do with a new license type. This would be for individuals who are seeking to reinstate their license, who had not attained all of their continuing education hours for their license to be fully reinstated. The board was supportive of creating a new 6-month temporary reinstatement license. That way, those individuals would be able to work under that limited period of time of 6 months while they're finishing up their continuing education hours. And then once they have those hours completed, then they could apply for their permanent license to be fully reinstated. And so this is another bridge to help people get back into the workforce more quickly. And then there was the creation of the community-based licenses. This was an item that was added by the legislature in committee, and it applies to individuals from 5 of the professions overseen by the BSRB. And this is an alternative to a temporary license for individuals that are still seeking to pass their permanent license. But individuals could apply for this. And if they meet the requirements, then they would be able to work for up to 24 months at one of the different types of facilities that is specifically listed in that statute, which would be the community mental health centers, the federally qualified health centers, FQHCs, a psychiatric residential treatment facility, PRTFs, or a private treatment facility that's defined in KSA 59-29B46. So those are now available, and individuals can apply for those as well. And then just a couple other notes about other items that we are still working to implement. We talked to you last time about the language that was added to the bill about the creation of an expedited application process. And so Leslie and I have continued to talk about that. We do have some language for you later in the meeting for you to take a look at. It is very preliminary language. We're still trying to figure out a good way to describe a lot of the conversation that we've had, making sure that we have individuals have notice up front that not everyone may be eligible for this new type of expedited license. We don't want to create a situation to where everyone starts applying for these if we wouldn't be able to expedite their application. And also we've had conversations recently that there really is a difference between the initial applicants versus the reciprocity applicants. So we'll need to make sure we have good language there. Individuals who apply through reciprocity, potentially we could have all of their materials, but applicants for original licensure, there's two decisions there. There's one as far as can they get approved to take the licensing examination, and then ultimately down the road, after they pass their exam and pay the fee, would they be eligible for the expedited licensure? So we have some language for you to look at as a starting point, but we're still working through some of those issues that I talked about. So that's one thing that we are still working on. And then one of the items that was added to the bill, but it is currently in progress, is I mentioned the behavior analyst. Their language and statute originally did not allow for us to have a way to reinstate a license. So if a behavior analyst had a license that expired, they would have to apply for a license from the beginning. And so one of the items that was added to the bill included language to authorize the BSRB to develop a reinstatement process. And so now that that bill has passed, the advisory committee has started to discuss putting in place a process to have the licenses reinstated upon request. And so we'll be working on that. And then just another item often to the radar for a couple years, but one of the items the legislature added changes the continuing education requirements as of July 1st, 2025. Currently, there is a requirement every 2-year license period. All individuals who are licensed by the BSRB need to have 6 hours in diagnosis and treatment if they are eligible to practice at that level, and then 3 hours of ethics. And so as of July 1st, 2025, the 6-hour requirement in diagnosis and treatment will be lowered from 6 to 3. That is not something that is going to take place until, like I mentioned, July 1st, 2025. But I did want to kind of put a bow on that to mention all the different items that were in the bill. So as I mentioned, we made a big push to put as many of these in place as of July 1st. It was quite an undertaking, but I was really happy that we were able to move so quickly, knowing that some of the other items we weren't able to put out in part because we needed authority to be able to issue those fees. And we needed a permanent regulation in place. And as a stopgap, we sought approval for a temporary regulation, and those were approved. So once we were able to finalize the applications and make sure that we were able to officially issue those, we were able to put those all into place. And so I want to thank Leslie Allen. I know she did a tremendous amount of work on meeting with different people to make sure this was taking place, and other staff members, the BSRB, working on all the different types of applications, making sure that we were testing these to make sure there weren't going to be issues when people were seeking for these to be issued. And so a lot of work took place behind the scenes, and we'll be kind of working through if there are any issues in the future, we'll make sure that we have a smooth process. But as I mentioned, there were a lot of different items in the bill, and we're in a really good spot with those items. So just kind of wanted to highlight those items, especially for the new board members who were not here when the original discussions were taking place on a lot of those items. So, and in terms of some other legislative items, so one other thing that was in the bill, there is a new requirement for the BSRB to send a message to all applicants within the first 15 days that someone applies for licensure, letting the person know if we have a complete file or if we're still missing items, if we need additional information. And then once we have determined that we have a complete application, we are directed to issue a decision within 30 days. But concerning that original 15-day letter, we built a new tracking tool in our licensing database to be able to make sure that those are being sent out, and then we can see the time frame between when the application was received and entered versus when those are being sent out. I've been working with Leslie, and we've been checking those on a weekly basis, making sure that those have all been sent out. I think as of about 2 weeks ago, or maybe a week ago, the last time that I had looked at those reports, we have met, I believe all of those have been sent out, with the exception of one. And that was a case where we were able to issue the license within the same week of the application arriving. So there was no need to send a message to let them know if it was complete or incomplete because the license had already been issued. But moving forward after that, we said, let's go ahead and send it to make sure that we're in compliance with the technical language of the bill, to make sure that we're doing good with this. And then we also put a tracking tool in terms of the 30-day requirement, and that's kind of the next step that we're moving on, trying to make sure we have something good in place. I feel like we're in a really good spot with the 15 days. And now with the 30 days, that's going to be what we're kind of shifting focus on while we're trying to have the new individuals who are licensing specialists trained and be aware of their responsibilities as well. Another legislative item, there was a bill that I mentioned that passed in 2021. That was House Bill 2066. And that bill basically changed a lot of the reciprocity requirements for applicants who were military members, military spouses, individuals that reside in Kansas, or those that intend to reside in Kansas. And so for individuals who are fit into those categories and who would fall under the language of that statute, they would have a different period of time for their reciprocity application to be processed, and they would be able to apply for licensure in a little bit of a different way. The legislature in that bill included a reporting requirement. So every year, every agency that essentially is affected by that bill has to issue a report to the legislature, basically indicating the time frame for when the application was received to when they had a complete application. And then they have to also indicate the time frame between when they had a complete application and when a decision was made. And so we had, I believe, a little over 100 or around 100 individuals that fit under that bill. And so we went ahead and looked at the time periods for those individuals and submitted the report to the legislature. And I'm happy to report that I think with the exception of maybe one or two, each of those decisions was made as soon as we received the last item that we received. With our setup, we receive an application fee, and we don't request the license fee until the end of the process, because by statute, we can't issue refunds. And so when we received all the materials and information and fees that we needed, we were able to issue those licenses usually on the same day that we received the last item we needed. So really happy with my staff. I know we have talked to them multiple times about this, let them know, especially for military members, military spouses, but for all individuals affected by this, that these really are a priority. And we want to make sure that we're in compliance with what the legislature has set up, but also making sure that we're helping these individuals get licensed as soon as possible. So really happy with how we're doing on that amount. Even though I know that, when you prioritize certain applications, it means that all the other ones have to get a little deprioritized, unfortunately. But these ones that have been focused by the legislature, I'm really happy with the period of time that we have in terms of turning those around and helping those people get licensed. Moving on to some other items, and I know this is kind of a longer report, but there's just been a lot of different things going on here. In terms of some other legislative items, there was a committee that met recently that dealt with mental health. It was approved for 2 days, and those meetings are available on the legislative YouTube channel. It was not a meeting that I was required to attend or speak at, but I did manage to observe the second day of those meetings. And as time allows, I'll go back and catch the first meeting, but I did hear them discuss a little bit of some of the recommendations from the 2020 Mental Health Modernization and Reform Committee, and they were revisiting a couple of those recommendations and looking at some of the different items. One item that was interesting, they did talk about there was some language in one of those original recommendations that dealt with basically diversity, equity, and inclusion type topics, and members of the legislature were looking to see have the agencies, move forward on some of these recommendations. And it was noted that they believed the BSRB had put forward a requested change to statute that did address that topic, but that was one of the items the legislature took out. So, we can't control what the legislature does, but I think in terms of if there were questions about if we were compliant with some of those recommendations, or if they were looking to see, did we move on those? I think that is helpful for that it was referenced in that committee, knowing that, the board considered those. We've discussed them in the past and they moved forward on some of those items, but ultimately it's the legislature that has the authority to pass the legislation. In terms of some other items, moving down to the associations and the first social work, Association of Social Work Boards, ASWB. One item of note, ASWB had contacted me recently noting that there's going to be a change in test vendor. And whenever that does occur, it does create some temporary issues in terms of timing for people scheduling exams. So we're going to try to figure out a way to put out some information, at least on the website, if not sending something out to individuals to let them know to expect a little bit of change with the testing vendor changing. But we want to make sure to highlight some of that information. So just wanted to bring it to your attention as well. There's also going to be an annual meeting for ASWB. That'll be later this year. I believe it's the first week in November. And then for the Association of State and Provincial Psychology Boards, ASPPB, their annual meeting is going to be later this year in September. And I will be attending that meeting with Richard Nobles and also Linda Heitzman-Powell. And just a note about the National Board for Certified Counselors, NBCC. In between the last time that we met, Laura Shaughnessy and I were able to attend that conference, and I think they had a lot of helpful information, a lot of good discussion about several different topics. Laura was able to attend a meeting in her role as the commissioner for the Professional Counseling Multi-State Compact as well. And so attending that meeting was really helpful, and I appreciate Laura attending that meeting as well. And I think we had conversations, and I think we both felt like we benefited from learning that information and being able to connect with people in other states and learning about their success stories and maybe some of their challenges, so we can bring those things here to talk about. And then one other meeting, I didn't mention this on the report, but there is a National Association for Marriage and Family Therapy, and they are also holding an annual meeting this year at the end of September. And Mary Jones and I are going to be attending that meeting later on this month as well. And so this will be the first opportunity that I've had to attend their National Association meeting, but I have heard a little bit of conversation about interest in a marriage and family therapy multi-state compact. It's very preliminary. I haven't heard that any groups have actually started to meet to really work on something like this, but right now they're gauging interest, and it'll be interesting to kind of give some input on that process and have the opportunity to kind of learn and bring back that information to Kansas as well. In terms of some other updates, the Kansas Fights Addiction Grant Review Board, the BSRB, by law, is able to appoint an individual to serve on that group. And the board selected Jason Hess to serve on that group about a year ago, a little bit over. And so Jason has included a report in your materials, so you can look to see what information he provided on that. Additionally, in terms of the SIPACT interjurisdictional compact, there was a mid-year meeting for SIPACT that I attended. There's going to be an annual meeting later on this year that I'll be attending. That is going to be, I believe, at the September 27th through October 1st. And so I'll be, actually, that's the ASPPB one. SIPAC is going to be November 16th through 17th, but it's a remote meeting, so I'll be able to attend that in between other items here at the office. So, and then I listed on here updates from the Professional Counseling Multi-State Compact. And Laura, if you have any items you would like to share on that, feel free to. The reason I listed that on the agenda is because we continue to get some questions about that compact. Individuals are very excited about it. They want to start practicing under that compact. And so we've talked to a few individuals, but I thought it might be a good time to kind of speak to that here at the meeting as well. That compact is still in the formation stage, and they're still working on setting it up so individuals can apply for a privilege to practice. And so we're hoping maybe by the end of this calendar year, or maybe sometime the start of next calendar year, that will be set up. But just kind of wanted to speak to that, because I know we receive a couple questions every week, and just kind of wanted to state that publicly. That's kind of where we're at. And Laura, I know that you've attended some of those meetings to kind of represent Kansas and learn more about the Compact Commission. So I thought I'd also kind of give you the opportunity if you wanted to add any more information on the Compact as well.
Sure. I'll just say that the October 25th governance meeting is when they really hope to have enough rules and regulations agreed upon and voted on that they can then say, here are some firm dates when the compact will be in effect. So, we'll just keep pushing those questions past that date so that we can have some formidable answers.
Sounds great.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yep. And then just a comment on the social work multi-state compact. I mentioned earlier that draft language was finalized at the end of March. It did pass in Missouri, but it was introduced in, I think, 6 other states, but it was so late in the session that those bills, I don't believe, have passed, not because they didn't have support, but mostly because of a timing type issue. So I do expect there to be a bill introduced in Kansas next year for discussion by the legislature. There was a recent meeting by the Social Work Advisory Committee where representatives from the Council for State Government, CSG, attended and presented information on the compact now that the language has been finalized. And so if any individuals are interested, there was a CSG also presented a presentation about a year ago when the language was still being discussed. And so that kind of gave the broad parameters of the compact, but I felt like their presentation at the most recent meeting was helpful too, now that we have specific language that they're asking states to pass. And so waiting to see kind of the details on that. As I mentioned earlier, when I talked about the budget and revenue and expenditures, one item for the board to consider at some point will be looking at the amount to charge if there is a multi-state license, if Kansas were to join that compact. Because right now, for some of our professions, about a third of our licensees live out of state. And so the reason that's important is because if there is a change to a model like the social work compact allows, where you can do a single state license or a multi-state license, and the individuals in those other states were to get a multi-state license where they live, they would no longer need to get a license in Kansas to be able to practice. And so that could significantly change the way that we collect revenue. And social work does make up the biggest profession. They make up about 55% of all of our licensees right now. And so I think individuals would be, I believe, willing to pay higher amount for a multi-state license because they would be able to practice in different states and not have to get the license in other states as well. It's just finding out the amount that we could charge to make up for the anticipated loss of revenue from people outside the state no longer getting a license in Kansas. So that'll be something to kind of work through and try to figure out. But we wanted to put that on your radar. We still get several requests for information about each week on the social work compact as well. So we are interested to see kind of how that moves forward. And then with that, I just wanted to highlight one other item on my report. I do try to list specific meetings that I've either attended on behalf of the BSRB or ones that we've facilitated here in the office. Some upcoming meetings of note. There is a meeting on September 20th, 2023. That will be an opportunity for Leslie Allen and I to attend a meeting. They're trying to add more modernization to the regulation submission process. As you might have seen, the regulation process does take a significant amount of time, and sometimes there are delays and things. It takes a long time for those things to be implemented. So they're working to try to modernize that process, and we're trying to learn a little bit more about what's going to happen from that. Additionally, I will be attending some of those conferences that I mentioned on here too. On October 3rd, we will have the open meeting here at the BSRB office, and that will be for the permanent regulations that are currently pending. I mentioned we had the temporary regulation on the fees that would have to be followed by the permanent regulations. Well, the permanent regulation requires there to be a meeting with the Joint Committee on Administrative Rules and Regulations that Leslie and I attended, and they asked us some questions about those regs. But there's also an opportunity for members of the public to ask questions and request possible changes to those. And so that is going to be on October 3rd at the BSRB office. It's from 10 a.m. until 11. It's an in-person meeting only. The last time that we had a similar meeting, there were no individuals who chose to attend that meeting, but by the requirements, we have to have one just to give an opportunity for that. Individuals who don't want to attend that meeting to provide public comment, who would rather just send in a message on those, are welcome to do so. They can contact me, and that process is listed in the announcement that's on our website, as well as the one that was published in the Secretary of State's publication as well, and the Kansas Register. So that's an important date that's coming up. board members are not required to attend that meeting. It is an optional meeting. It's more for us to provide that opportunity. If you do want to attend that meeting, just go ahead and let us know. But like I mentioned last time, it was just an open meeting and we didn't have anybody from the public attend. One other item that I did want to let you know about, this is something new and I'm kind of excited about it. I have heard in past years before my time, there was a forum for educators. This was an opportunity for the BSRB to connect with some of the schools and provide an opportunity for the BSRB to provide some information about recent changes in laws, some of the discussions by the board, give an opportunity for individuals from different schools to ask questions, and maybe provide some opportunity for them to indicate some of their frustrations or some items that maybe they would request the board take a look at. And so, like I mentioned, this has been several years. I came in during the pandemic when a lot of these meetings were pretty limited, but there have been some individuals asking that we could have another educator forum. And so we've been looking at possible dates. And we are planning to hold that educator forum by Zoom to allow more people to attend it on Tuesday, October 17th. And that is most likely going to be from maybe 1 p.m. until 2 p.m. I know a lot of the individuals who are at schools teach classes in the mornings. So hopefully that will be a little bit more flexible. But we're looking at Tuesday, October 17th from 1 p.m. to 2 p.m. And we're going to be sending something out to the educators that we do have in terms of our mailing list, and then trying to see if we can connect with other individuals, but maybe planning about an hour for that meeting to allow for some time for some news, and then also get some question answers and some input. And then we've also heard a request to have a similar forum, but to have it more for employers. And so we are planning to hold a similar one also by Zoom. And for that one, we're looking to do it the following day on Wednesday, October 18th. And that would also be from 1 p.m. until 2 p.m. So we are going to be putting out some information here, and we'll try to share that with different groups that we think might be interested. And so that'll be something new. Looking forward to finding new ways to connect with people and help get the information out in terms of what the board is doing, collect more information. And so I'm looking forward to both of those meetings, but wanted to share that with you as well. So at that point, I will go ahead and end my report and stand for any questions.
Hey, Dave,
Yes.
can you provide us an update as to where we're at with being able to track how long applications are taking to get through the process?
Sure. So for those ones that are the 2066, we provided information for a report for those individuals, and that was about 100 of the applicants. And so those we had specific when individuals applied, and then we had a complete file, and then we had a complete file and a decision was made. And so that information has been provided based on the professions, the amount of time between the original application versus having everything we needed differed, but I could find that for you. In terms of the other applicants, I mentioned we put in that new tracking tool, which the legislature asked us to do with the effective date of that bill. So as of July 1st, we've been tracking that 15-day requirement. And so we've been meeting that consistently for all the applications from when that was effective July 1st through just about a week ago, or the last time that I looked at that report. In terms of our next focus, it will be looking at the second part of that, which was once we have a complete application, we're looking to see, can we make a decision within 30 days? And so knowing that those military ones have a shorter time period, those ones, the bill requires 15 days. But for the general ones, we're looking at the 30 days. And so that's the next step we're working on. We were trying to move on that step at the same time as we're working on the 15-day one, but with the changes in staff and bringing in new employees, that was a little bit too much of a juggle initially. So we are kind of focusing on that topic right now. So sorry, I don't have any specific numbers on that, but I know that it is going to be a priority for us now that we've got the 15-day in a good spot. But the second part of that will be the next thing that we focus on. And I can try to have more information for you, maybe at the offsite planning meeting at the end of October.
Thank you.
David, I have a question.
Hmm?
Will the two forums that you mentioned that you're going to be hosting in mid-October, will they be televised or on the YouTube channel so we can watch?
They're not official meetings of the BSRB, so they won't be on the YouTube channel. But any members of the board are definitely welcome to attend. If you would like to, just let me know and I can give you the Zoom access for it.
Great.
Um,
Okay, terrific.
One of the things is to make sure that we have secure meetings. This will be a lot bigger of a group and a lot of different people than we're used to having. And so we're going to attempt it with Zoom to make sure that we have kind of a good process, but we have more controls for our board meetings. And so we're going to try to do this one over Zoom. I know in the past, it was probably mostly an in-person type of an event, but I just don't want to risk that something potentially could go wrong with it being a new group of people that we're interacting with over Zoom. So,
Sure. Thank you.
but yeah, I should have mentioned that. I apologize. Yeah, any board members who would like to attend either of those events, just let me know. I'm happy, and I'll probably go ahead and forward the Zoom information to you on that, just in case you would like to attend either of those. You don't have to. Like I mentioned, it's not an official meeting of the board. It's not an official meeting for the BSRB. It's just a nice opportunity, I think, for us to offer a method for them to learn more information about all the things that you all have spent so much time on, and give them the opportunity to ask questions. And so hopefully I'm very optimistic. I think it'll be a good process, but I want to make sure we have some good controls in place as well.
Thank you.
Other questions? I know there was a lot to cover in that report, so thank you for that. Okay, well, staff reports are next.
I don't have any report today.
Thank you, Leslie.
And Mary, the only thing I would say is that we did provide the list of permanent licenses. I mentioned last time that report was getting very long, and so we have condensed it to have fewer timeframes and past periods mentioned here on the chart. Hopefully it makes it a little easier to read. But if any individuals have questions about some of the past information, they can reach out and I'm happy to provide that.
We'll move on to the complaint review committee report, Cindy.
Since we have new board members, we thought this would be a good time to good opportunity to explain the information in the complaint review committee packet. The first 2 pages are the disposition of cases. That's what the label is. This is data regarding investigations. This is the result of the complaint review committee reviewing cases. The first page, which is 1 column, is fiscal year 24. The next pages are regarding complaints or RAVs or reports of alleged violations. If you want to look at the last 2 pages, those are cases. There's 2 charts. Those are cases that are currently open, and those are cases that are received this fiscal year. And both of these are broken down by licensees type and licensee percentage. And this is the information that we've always provided. Dave just helped by formatting this a little bit, and you also have with it fiscal year 24 and fiscal year 2023 with it, so you can always compare it.
Are there any questions for Cindy or the?
For some of the new board members, I did want to highlight one thing that we added about maybe a year ago or so. On the last page, it's that document that's called RAV statistics for FY 2024, and you can see the previous one for FY 2023. I just want to highlight that last column, RAVs per licensees. So in the past, we had presented a lot of information about how many cases we received or how many were still open. And then we gave it by those professions. But as I said earlier, our largest profession is social work. And so knowing the frequency of the complaints with knowing how many applicant or how many licensees we have is helpful to kind of put in context which professions are receiving the most complaints or which of these professions have the most open cases. And so that RAV/licensees column, if you look at that, what that is trying to describe, the higher the number, the higher percentage that profession is receiving complaints. And so for some of these groups, it's a very small number of licensees. And so kind of take that with a grain of salt on some of these. But if you're just looking at pure numbers, this is a measure that's trying to look at the other side of that, that basically says, if all of the groups had the same amount of licensees, which of these groups receives the most complaints? And so hopefully that is helpful information to you, but that is something we added about a year ago on behalf of a request by the board members to try to represent that.
Okay, any other questions or comments about the information? The CRC committee does a lot of work, reviews a lot of cases, and we try to do that as efficiently as possible. So if other board members are ever interested in learning more, Cindy or myself can answer questions for you. But it's a heavy lift, and the committee members are really dedicated to being thorough with what they review. Anything else, Cindy, from?
Anyone's free to contact me anytime.
Okay, well, we are going to move on. Thank you so much. We're going to move on to the professions reports, and we'll start with licensed psychology.
So, licensed psychology met on the 8th of August, 2023. I don't want to put us back 10 years. We largely introduced new members, and Dave administered training for the new members of the advisory committee. That was the bulk of our meeting. And our next meeting will be on the 10th of October, 2023. We will seek to discuss change to unprofessional conduct regulations and also discuss the ASPPB CPQ program.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Richard. Social work.
I can.
Yeah, I was not able to attend that meeting, Andrea. I don't know if she's. Can you report, David?
Yes, and she might have stepped away. So the Social Work Advisory Committee did meet last month, and one of the major parts of the meeting was there were individuals from the Council for State Government, that CSG, that came to talk about the finalized language of the Social Work Compact. And so they answered some questions, and that was really helpful information. And I believe one of the other items that committee dealt with was the annual training for board members and advisory committee members. And so they had the opportunity to get a refresher on those topics and ask any questions that dealt with COMA or CAPA or CORA or any of the different requirements and expectations and rules.
Okay, thank you so much for that. Professional counseling.
Hello, everyone. The Professional Advisory Committee met on August 7th, and we did a recap of the MBCC conference and the Compact conference. I do want to add, David Bai presented at this conference. He did a terrific job. He spoke about applying public protections, and so many people came up to me afterward, and the feedback was how intelligent, how thorough, how entertaining, and how humble he is when he makes a presentation. And it seems to me like he will be continuing to be asked to present at the conferences that we attend. The conference was very helpful, very enlightening. And so we gave a report about that. The majority of the time we spent on training new committee members. And some of the things that we're working on an ongoing basis, closing the reciprocity loophole that exists, and discussion of supervision from other professions, unprofessional conduct we continue to work on, and among other things. And our next meeting will be on October 2nd. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. Licensed master's level psychology.
The LMLP LCP advisory group met on August 16th. We spent the initial part of our meeting getting to know our 3 new advisory committee members. Then Dave did the training for board members and advisory committee members. That took up a large part of our meeting. We continued discussions on recognizing APA accreditation from LP programs as whether or not that would satisfy master's level psychology applicants. And Leslie Allen's working on drafting up some language for the advisory committee to review at our next meeting, which will be on October 6th. We will also be taking up continued discussion of the unprofessional conduct regs and talking about computer testing. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Dave. Marriage and Family Therapy Advisory Committee met August 11th. We reviewed applications for adding additional committee members and voted to approve 1 committee member out of that. We've continued to talk about unprofessional conduct regulations, impacts to clinical training plans, supervision of other professionals outside of the license. We will have our next meeting October 13th, and I'm guessing we will have some training at that point since we'll have added a committee member by then. The next one is addiction counseling.
The Committee for Addictions Counseling did meet on August 25th, and the committee members welcomed me and another new committee member, Zenobia Williams. Much of the time of our meeting was spent on the annual training for board members, committee members for the BSRB. We did discuss possible changes to clinical training plan requirements to reflect the reduction in number of hours from 4,000 to 3,000 hours, to reflect the time frame for those 3,000 hours to be completed. And the committee did suggest that this be returned back to the board to reflect that those hours be completed in no fewer than 18 months to maintain the ratio. And at the next meeting, we will be talking about possible changes to regulations for documentation of continuing education and continuing education requirements for licensees. Our next committee meeting will be October 13th.
Thank you, Jill. And you may have noticed in our agenda that came up for future items, particularly the length of time to 18 months to our offsite planning on October 23rd. So we'll talk about that later on in the meeting. Thanks. Thank you for that. And just lost my agenda place here, but last one is behavior analysts.
Yeah, so we met on August 11th, and that was the first time that I was served in the role of chair for that meeting. Part of the meeting was dedicated to looking at new board members or subcommittee members, since we had some that were revolving off. There were 7 applicants, I think, and what we decided to do was add 4 so that we had staggered new members instead of everybody transitioning off at the same time and having a whole new slate. And so we welcomed 4 new members: Kelly Harrison, Pamela Neidert, Stephanie Wiley, and Mike Williams. We reviewed a packet of proposed changes to the professional conduct regulations. to determine if those changes should be added to the proposed changes for the Behavior Analyst Advisory Committee. We're going to discuss those at the next meeting. We also reviewed regulations on continuing ed and documentation for continuing ed. We'll review that at the next meeting. We looked at 2 possible new regulations, one that focused on the location for the clients for jurisdictional purposes, and the second to develop a process for reinstating licenses that have expired. And I think David touched on that earlier because we didn't have anything in our legislation that discussed or allowed a license to be reinstated. We're going to again discuss that at a future meeting. We spent a lot of time talking about looking for board support. There's a new proposed change to the Kansas State Medicaid plan for a children's behavior interventionist service. And they say that LMHPs can be included as practitioners who are eligible to provide that service, but behavior analysts aren't in there. So because of the nature of that and the discussion of that, we're going to discuss that at the October 23rd meeting, I believe, or request that it be discussed at that meeting. We decide, and then finally, the last thing that we decided to do, because up until this point, we have not had a standing meeting. We decided that we wanted all future meetings to be the second Friday of the month, every other month, from 1 p.m. to 3 p.m. And so everybody voted on it. And so now we'll have standing meetings. Does that sound about right, David?
That sounds perfect.
Thank you, Linda, for that report. As according to our agenda, it is time for a 10-minute break. So if everyone is on board with that, we will pause the meeting and take 10 minutes. So by my clock, David, that says we'd be back by 11:28.
That's right. And for those of you that are new to the board meetings, I'll just put people back into the waiting room, and then I'll let everyone back in at 10:28 or 11:28.
Okay, thank you.
Oh,
Okay, so it looks like we're all back. Is your streaming back on, Dave?
Yes, we are live, so we are ready to start whenever you'd like to start.
Okay, let's get back to it. We're going to go to the next agenda item, which is old business. And we had continued discussion on the possible changes to the 45-day requirement that we've been talking about with respect to the clinical training plan. So Dave, you want to fill in a little bit there?
Sure. So I will go ahead and start the conversation by just framing this. This is an item that the board has talked about, and I believe most of the advisory committees have discussed as well. I will share my screen here. Okay, in your packet of material, you have a regulation as an example for the language that we're discussing. This one is KAR 102-2-8 supervision, and this is for the social work profession. But if you go to the very end of the regulation, you'll see the topic, and that is item number 7. And what that language says is all changes to the clinical supervision training plan shall be submitted by the supervisee to the board for its approval. The changes shall be submitted no more than 45 days after the date on which the changes took effect. If the supervisee fails to submit the change to the board within that 45-day period, no supervised hours of practice shall be accrued or credited for any practice beginning on the date the changes took effect through the date on which the changes to the plan are approved by the board. And while this is the social work regulation, a lot of the other professions have language that is the same, if not the same, it's nearly identical. So where this conversation originally started was the board is put in a position sometimes when individuals apply for clinical licensure to essentially look to see, has that person completed all of their hours? And if they made a change and failed to report it, as this regulation states, those changes are to be reported within 45 days. And if you fail to report a change within that 45-day period, the language says no supervised hours of practice shall be accrued or credited for any practice beginning on the date the changes took effect through the date on which the changes to the plan are approved by the board. And following this regulation, it's very strict language, but it basically says that if this applies, any hours accrued after that change would not be counted, which meant that the person would either be denied for licensure for insufficient hours or would be given the opportunity in some cases to go back and accrue the hours. And this is calculated as them making a change or notification to the board, and now they can go back and complete the hours that they are short. And so the board talked about this 45-day rule. And if this is serving the purpose intended by the board, or if this is too punitive, the board had a conversation about it and asked the advisory committees to discuss this. And I believe most of the advisory committees that have language like this for their regulations have discussed it as well. We've also had some conversations here with our staff because I think there's a lot of things to factor into this conversation. One, what is the real purpose behind this regulation language? We are a state that does require the training plans to be approved at the beginning. And this change, I believe this item was originally put in to ensure that people weren't accruing hours that would not be counted towards clinical licensure. And so the 45-day was to motivate them to report changes, so that way they wouldn't be doing hours that wouldn't count. But the language of it means that the hours are essentially ruled out, even if they would have counted, if you would have notified the board in that time period. And right now, from a licensing standpoint with my staff, it's a very clear line that if someone fails to report it and they contact us, we point to the regulation and we say, based on this, those hours won't count. And so you need to go back and review them. And so the advisory committees have discussed some possible alternatives. And so I think maybe with that, I'll just kind of turn it back over to the board, and then any board members can share their thoughts on possible changes. I know Leslie Allen and I have had some continuing conversation with this too, because one of our goals, I think we all want to make it something that will be improved and help more people. We also want to make sure that we have clear direction for my staff too, so that when people have questions, they know what to tell them. And knowing that you as board members, you're sacrificing a lot of time to serve as board members. But if this is handled in a different way that can really open things up a lot, that could mean an increase in the amount of time that you as board members would be working on these items too. So a lot of things to factor in this conversation, but I'll turn it back over to the board members if you want to weigh in and talk about what your advisory committees discussed, or Mary, if you have thoughts that you want to talk about first, I'll turn it back over to you.
Sure, thank you. I think it's been an interesting conversation, particularly among our advisory committee, but something I've heard you say now a couple of times, so it just sort of resonated and stuck with me differently this morning when you were talking about that originally, because we're a state, we approved the plans initially before they ever go. And also there was this sense of the 45-day time period allowed for approving something that may not be approved ahead of time, so that essentially the licensee wouldn't be in trouble at the end of their plan if something weren't approved. So from that standpoint, thinking about it a little bit differently is if the 45-day were removed in total, then what are you left with? We're left with a sort of similar situation as to what we've encountered now, which is something may not be approved, and we'd have to go back and say, you can't do anything with your last 6 months, 8 months, a year, however long that time is. However, in the situations we've had now, we've created that problem because of the 45-day time period. So again, just heard it a little bit differently. Can you guys hear me? Okay, I thought it froze up for a minute. I was looking at my internet like, uh-oh. So there's sort of an interesting reflection I'm having based on that. I think when the MFT advisory committee looked at this, I think the sense was more worried around what should and should not be reported. In total, there was more interest in that than the time frame, but there was a strong sense that at some point the licensee has to be responsible for updating their plan, keeping in communication, all of those things too. So I'll see what other comments are from other board members now.
I think when the Social Work Advisory Committee discussed it, we had similar concern about how would you define what is a substantial change in your plan. And, we came up with several categories that we thought would qualify as substantial, and several that we didn't think were substantial. So I think any change that we make, we would need to have some of those definitions or examples at least available to licensees and people who are pursuing a clinical license, so they have some idea of what types of changes are most important for them to report. And then we talked about trying to soften the language that if they fail to report within 45 days, that they may not be able to count the hours until such time as they do, between when that's found, when that's learned, and when they do report it, as a way of still having that requirement that whatever your original plan was, if it changes substantially, then your training plan is no longer valid. So there needs to be some kind of requirement that the board be notified. But we all hate having to disallow, hundreds of hours of practice that people have put in towards their clinical license. So there was a strong feeling of wanting to try to open up some space to not have to do that as often as we have under the current regs.
I do have a question for Leslie, and I've probably asked this before, so forgive me, because I know we've had a few conversations about this, but how many and what grounds do we actually deny clinical training plans?
I don't actually have, I don't think we denied very many. We may ask for more information, but I don't think we denied very many. And if we did, it would be based on the work site. Usually,
Based
I
on a
mean,
work site.
but because they can correct the things, you know, your ratio or how often you meet and all that stuff they can fix, but you can't fix where you work if you're not diagnosing and treating. So, and I don't think that many people send them in when they're not. So,
Sure. Yeah, I think that's where my mind's going again, is we sort of created this opportunity to deny that really perhaps was again, well-intended. So it's just had me thinking about it a little bit differently. And also when those plans are sent in, I am imagining we don't deny very many of those addendums or changes to plans.
mhm.
And so, you know, are we in a situation where we're overseeing at a level we shouldn't? Or, you know, do we really feel strongly that these changes need to be submitted, but it's for the protection of the licensee, really, in counting their hours?
I told Dave the other day we were discussing this, and I did tell Dave, I think more people are punished currently because they didn't submit a change, so they can't count the hours, than it would be if we just said you should submit, you know, submit changes to your training plan, and if they don't, and they work somewhere where it won't count, then those people lose those hours. I think that would be far fewer in number than is happening now.
That's sort of where my mind's at. So thank you for sharing that, Leslie.
Mhm.
Other advisory committee discussions?
I agree with what Cynthia said. I think a couple of minor changes to the language at least allows the board to have some flexibility as we review those in terms of deciding whether those changes were significant enough to warrant them having to report them, because we've seen some where I think we felt like that really wasn't that big a change, but when the language says all changes, you know, it puts us in a pretty precarious position, I think.
Can I just say a few things? So, the board is going to receive a lot more applications if that is the route we go. Because there are many people, we say, you know, you didn't submit your change, and they accept that and they don't push it. So you're only seeing the people that pushed it and said, no, I want the board to make an exception. So that is going to increase the board's work level. In addition to that, training plan amendments cannot go to CAPA. Only applications can go into CAPA. So if it's simply a training plan amendment, it's going to have to be seen by the full board in an open meeting. So that those will all go into the actual board meeting every other month. Because we won't be able, we'll have to bring you everything because we won't be able to make the determination.
Well, even if we had set some standards about what constitutes a substantial change and what doesn't, if the board set those standards, would that not still allow you to
I don't feel
approve or
like
deny?
it does, because if you say the board may deny, then it would be the board's decision, unless you made it very clear. And then if anyone asks, the answer is no. You know what I mean? Because
Right.
they'll say, well, I want the board to look at it. And so that's what I mean. It will be, if it says may, I think more people will ask that the board make that determination.
And when you say a lot more, how many do you think you deny just automatically?
I would have to ask Joan. I don't really have that number. I apologize. I can see if I'll text her and see if she can give me a number.
Okay, thanks.
I think it's kind of a tricky situation, and having sat in all of the advisory committees and heard all of the good discussion, because I think that there is a problem with the 45-day rule, and I think it's having a pretty significant penalty for people. And in pursuing sort of a creative approach to this, I've heard a lot of good discussion about adding flexibility to it and opening it up. The only thing that gives me pause is that I wonder if there is flexibility, is it too vague? And so we're going to have people that will be caught into the, we've talked about adding specific language to the regulation as far as, these are the things we specifically want to highlight, but we want to allow some flexibility to call it a substantial change. And so if it's not a substantial change, I mean, there's still going to be some confusion, I think, there too. And so in talking to Leslie and also talking to each of the advisory committees, I'm honestly torn and towards what to recommend for you on this item. I wonder, we haven't really had a lot of discussion on this with the advisory committees, but if the regulation was changed to take out that 45-day penalty, but just have language that says the hours that you accrue have to match what the training plan would approve, and don't have the penalty, and then perhaps we as an agency can just send reminders periodically that says, if you did make a change, please let us know so we can see if you're still accruing hours towards what's acceptable. But if you just removed that 45-day penalty, then if someone made a change but it still matched what their training plan or what the regulations would allow, then there would really be no penalty at the end, and there would be no reason for the board to need to review it. So I've kind of been thinking through this and trying to figure out what to recommend to the board, but I wonder what your thoughts are on something like that.
Well,
So then-
I know, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
So then who would determine if the change at the point that they apply for the license, then who determines if the change that occurred matched their original plan sufficiently to qualify?
Yeah, I think that would probably be our licensing staff, kind of the same members of the staff that are looking at it right now. It just, if something were to be a change, but it still is an acceptable way of practicing under the regulations, then there just you wouldn't have to disqualify those hours for the 45-day requirement. If it was
That's really what
go ahead. Well, if it was something that would have been approved, it would be fine. So the only ones that are just going to be an issue at that point are ones where someone made a change that really fell outside of what would have been approved anyway. And it sounds like, in talking to Leslie, those ones are more rare. It sounds like more of the ones that are being denied for the 45-day have to do with the technical 45-day number versus the type of services that are being provided.
And I think that's where I was hearing, what I've at least experienced in this particular area is that we are denying based on 45 days, not because of the work that's being done, the scope of practice, or, a new work site, new supervisor kind of change. And so your suggestion of simply removing the timeline, but saying you need to report things, to the board for they'll still have to do addendums and make those changes, that still allows staff to say, this is appropriate, this is not appropriate, you have to diagnose and treat. I think that's, from my standpoint, something I would like to take back to my advisory committee and have them weigh in on.
I agree with that. And I think the idea of reminders, if there's a way that you can set that up in your system so the people who are on those plans automatically get that, it really then, if they do something, it makes it hard for them to come to us and say, hey, I want an exception, when we've been kind of constantly reminding them about the need to do that. I think that's a great idea.
Mm-hmm. And I don't know if it's how prominently it's stated in the original paperwork that's signed when we do a contract between the supervisor and the supervisee, but it could be bolded or even printed in a different color, that you must report changes, even if we take away the 45-day requirement.
Currently in the training plan, it says, please tell us how you will send all training plan amendments within 45 days. And they all
Okay.
answer, they have to put 45 days in their answer or it won't be approved.
Okay.
I mean, we would tell them, you know.
Well, and it's in those approval letters too. I mean, you even
Uh-huh.
reiterated again in the approval letter when they received their training plan date and documents. So it sounds like, do we have consensus to take this back to our advisory committees and look at that language change?
Yes, I do have a quick question though. I'm fine with bringing it back to psychology. With respect to changes that would be substantive, like if someone has a supervisory change, or if they have a role change, are we thinking that the staff would send back those changes, indicating that that has been a substantive change, and thus we're not going to grant the license? Would the appeal then be, if they were to decide to appeal, would that still be a Kappa appeal?
Well, I think the idea would be to get away from the substantive change type idea. It would be more so, is the type of work they're doing consistent with what the regulations would allow for someone with a clinical training plan? And so instead of it saying all changes need to be reported or substantial changes need to be reported, I think it would be more along the lines of, is the thing that they changed to, is that still something that's fitting under the regulations?
Gotcha. Okay.
And I think in terms of it going to Kappa, I think kind of what Leslie mentioned, Kappa comes into play when somebody has an application for the board where there's really a question about licensure and it's a specific person. So I think if they were asking for, kind of a ruling, but they weren't applying for licensure yet because, they were still knowing that they needed to get some time, I don't think that would go under Kappa. But and Tim, I know that if you have thoughts on this and you want to weigh in, feel free. I have a general understanding of Kappa, but I'll look to your direction if you have some thoughts you want to add on that too.
Yeah, I don't think it comes into play until you actually have a formal application, which would impact licensure. And so, I mean, that's typically the stage I think you see it at from what I've seen so far, is you have a formal licensure application, and then you notice that there's been an issue with a previous training plan, or at least an amendment wasn't submitted to the board, and that's the posture I've seen it in. So I think you're correct with your answer.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate it.
So I asked Joan, and Joan said that maybe 8 to 10 have been denied in the last year, and probably around 10 were they accepted what she said. And then we have, the ones we bring into Kappa. The thing that I struggle with is it says all, and if they don't understand all, how are they going to understand some? So that's kind of where I'm getting hung up, I guess.
Understood. Okay, well, I think we have agreement that we're going to take this discussion to the next advisory committee meetings. And hopefully David or Leslie will be able to draft something we'll have available to look at there. But I think it's good discussion and very much along the lines of the things we've been trying to talk about, with just eliminating unnecessary things that are impeding people who are otherwise qualified to obtain their licensure. So thank you for that discussion. We are going to move on to the next item of old business, which is discussion of considerations of practitioners from different professions based on extenuating circumstances. So Dave, if you want to kick us off again with reminding us the complexity of this one, and then we'll get some feedback from our board members.
Can I just interrupt? I'm so sorry, Mary. I think
Sure,
David
you bet.
had David had his hand up, I believe.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, I just had a quick question. I'm certainly over my skis in asking this, but I wonder if one of the ways to limit the impact of this rule would be to make it so that things that are minor changes aren't considered to be changes. In other words, like when the plan is approved, include variability as part of the original plan. So that then if that variability occurs, if it's kind of expected potential variability, it doesn't become a event that requires notice to the staff. So that probably could be part of the discussion that's going back to the committees anyway, but it just seemed to me one way to narrow the impact of the current kind of 45-day cliff rule would be to reduce the amount of scenarios that fall into, you know, that situation.
Okay, thank you for that. We'll make sure to add that in the discussion as well.
Madam Chair,
Yes.
if I may, I think that's an interesting point. And one thing I think you could consider also would be, you know, it's a sort of a zero-sum game if somebody doesn't submit a change. The stage that you typically, I think, are made aware of the failure to submit a change is when they apply for licensure. At that point in time, you know, you have a formal application and you have a range of options under your various statutes, from, you know, I guess a diversion maybe at the lower end all the way up to denying the application. And so it seems like you could build in a mechanism where you would be able to, you know, possibly impose a sanction or discipline, not deny the application outright. You could certainly, you know, whether it could be censure or something along those lines, you know, you didn't notify us timely, your change would have been approved, but here's the result. We're going to take some kind of action in response to your failure to do what you're supposed to do.
Sounds like that would add a layer of new complexity for us to think about, Tim. Thank you for the comments, though. I mean, I think that's what we're trying to do, is really talk thoroughly through these conversations so we understand what we can and can't do in these situations, and knowing that, you know, we were really initiating this 45-day to protect the licensee, and in some way it's just done the opposite thing, and we're all trying to figure that out. So thank you. Good pieces for that discussion to take back to the committees. Okay, now we will move to the practitioners of serving as supervisors based on extenuating circumstances. So Dave, I'll kick that back to you.
Okay, thanks, Mary. And so there are two professions, professional counseling and marriage and family therapy, that have language and regulation that allows individuals from other professions to serve as supervisors under certain conditions. And so in your packet of material, you have a copy of KAR 102-3-7A, and that's for professional counseling. And you have 102-5-7A, which is for marriage and family therapy. And I will share my screen and just pull up the version of the regulation for professional counseling. So here you see a copy of 102-3-7A. And what I'm going to focus on here is under C. It says the clinical supervisor of a person attaining the 3,000 hours of postgraduate supervised professional experience required for licensure as a clinical professional counselor at the time of providing supervision shall be a board-approved clinical supervisor and shall meet one of the following provisions. And item number 3, well, I'll just say item number 1 and number 2 talk to individuals who, one is a clinical supervisor, shall be a clinical professional counselor who's licensed in Kansas, or is registered or licensed in another jurisdiction, and who has practiced as a clinical professional counselor for 2 years beyond the supervisor's license date. 2, if a licensed clinical professional counselor is not available, the clinical supervisor may be a person who's qualified by educational coursework and degree for licensure as a clinical professional counselor in Kansas and has at least 5 years of postgraduate professional experience in clinical professional counseling. Number 3 is the item highlighted here that has been discussed recently. Under extenuating circumstances approved by the board, the clinical supervisor may be a person who is licensed at the graduate level to practice in one of the behavioral sciences and whose authorized scope of practice permits the independent practice of counseling, therapy, or psychotherapy. The qualifying individual shall not have less than 2 years of clinical practice beyond the qualifying licensure date when the individual provided the clinical supervision. And so there's really a couple questions here. One has been, so first, as kind of a reference, the term extenuating circumstances is a term of art for the BSRB, and extenuating circumstances calls for something to be an extreme situation that is beyond the person's control, that either prevents compliance with the requirement or makes it unadvisable to comply with the requirement. And so basically it calls for an extreme situation. And in this, it basically allows for individuals from other professions under the BSRB at the appropriate level to serve as a counselor or a supervisor. The question is, how should BSRB staff weigh what should be approved for someone who is seeking to use someone from another profession to provide supervision? We have had a few different reasons that people have requested this. Previously, the language in the regulation had called for it to be if someone is unavailable, but that was changed, and that was changed in part because there was a recent change to allow all supervision by televideo. So you can do remote supervision, which really changed what really availability meant. So now it calls for extenuating circumstances. So part of this is, how should the BSRB weigh these requests and evaluate them under if it's an extenuating circumstance or not? And then there's kind of a greater question, and that is that many of the professions under the BSRB do not include this type of language that allows for people from other professions to serve as supervisors. These two professions currently do. But in looking at this and trying to evaluate this, part of the discussion was, is this something that the board is still supportive of, or would you prefer a different option in terms of allowing that flexibility? And so that hopefully frames the topic. And Leslie, Alan, is there anything I didn't mention that you think would be helpful in terms of the discussion on this point?
No, I don't think so.
Okay. And so we have received a few requests for consideration under this, and we've been trying to weigh them, but applying the extenuating circumstances evaluation is difficult because what is an extreme situation beyond someone's control? Some of the requests have focused on things like cost as a factor, and other ones have really sort of talked about preferences in terms of who they wanted as far as a specific person or someone who worked in a specific area. And so kind of wanted to turn it over to you as board members to discuss this. I know some of the advisory committees have discussed it as well. So Mary, I'll turn it back over to you, but hopefully that helps frame the conversation.
Yeah, thank you very much. It was really helpful. And I wonder, again, as I'm listening to the opening comments about this, if I'm always interested in sort of the origins of why it was in professional counseling and MFT. And my thinking has to be there were less supervisors around. I mean, if you think about these professionals being younger in general than some of the other, I wonder if that's part of it. And so writing in this language around extenuating circumstances was a way around that. It then also created this situation now. My advisory committee for MFT did talk about this, and I have to say that overwhelmingly, there was not interest in having other supervisors other than MFTs supervising MFTs. And I think, from my perspective, I'd love to hear that from board members. I think most professions feel the same way about their license type, even if they're more similar in training than certainly psychology is sort of out there in a very different type of training. But I think there's probably a general consensus that people think that their way of practicing needs to be supervised by others who have been trained in that way of thinking. And I use the example with Dave earlier that that marriage and family therapy are trained specifically in systemic thinking in how we diagnose and treat it. So we want that incorporation into supervision. And so the advisory committee was really not in support of having many loopholes for that, particularly around now with the access as it is to other supervision. So other board members, opinions and thoughts?
Yes, I'd like to weigh in. Our advisory committee feels similarly about keeping LPCs supervised by PLPC or by LCPCs. And so that's my comment. My question is, since televideo or telehealth has been widely accepted, have the number of extenuating circumstances applications gone down?
Not really.
Okay. Okay.
I think a lot of this has come, oh, sorry, Leslie.
No,
Go
go
ahead.
ahead.
Just gonna say, I think a lot of it, as I understand it, is coming from agencies or organizations where they have an in-house supervisor and that could use that as an employee benefit, right? I can provide your supervision free to you or in some other payment arrangement that makes it really cost effective for the licensee. And that's where I think we're hearing a lot of these things that, I have another discipline license here, but it's not mine, and can I get approval on a training plan?
And one of the challenging things for us in reviewing these and trying to evaluate them is that the current test, in terms of whether that can be applied, calls for an extenuating circumstance, which really calls for an extreme situation beyond your control. And usually, the board has talked about, well, the pandemic constituted an extreme situation, and there's very little disagreement about that. In terms of individual applicants, when we've had an extenuating circumstance applied to like a temporary license, when there has been a really significant health issue, with someone that prevented them from, being able to take the test or something like that, that's a really significant thing that really impacted that. It was beyond their control. It was extreme and it was significant. And in this situation, it's really hard to apply that extenuating circumstances test because what do you call an extreme situation? It's not as if a facility has burned down or something like that. It seems like it is more a matter in some cases in terms of preference, and that's just not the test that currently is in the regulation. And so if that is something the board would want to support, we would probably ask you to change the language in there to make it sort of a test that would allow something like that. But if that's not what you're interested in allowing, we can move forward on that. We just kind of wanted to highlight this because we were struggling with applying this new test. And also wanted to bring this regulation to your attention to see if you were still interested in this staying in the regulation, or if you had other thoughts in terms of if this should be removed or changed in some other way. So
I do think that cost is a barrier for a lot of people in seeking clinical supervision, and that's a legitimate factor. I worked for an agency when I started my clinical supervision that had someone on staff that provided the supervision, but then she left, and so they gave me like an allowance to put towards paying for my supervision outside the agency. Perhaps when we have the meeting with employers, that could be something that gets discussed about how they might provide that as a benefit in order to help grow the professions. I think the other factor is that, yes, you can study for the exam on your own, but I think if you're not being supervised by someone in your profession who was trained the way you were, who thinks with that lens, through that lens, that it could make it difficult for those people to pass the exam once they complete their supervision with someone who's not a member of their profession. And yeah, the idea that, well, there isn't anyone within 200 miles of me, that's no longer such an issue because of telehealth and the ability to do it that way.
So I have a question. Does the board maintain a list of individuals that are willing to supervise?
We do for LPCs and LCMFTs, LCPCs and LCMFTs, because they have board approved supervisors. The other professions do not.
Which then is a barrier to somebody in Dodge that's trying to get supervision and there's nobody in their area and they don't know how to find people that are external to where their region.
They could provide they could request a list of like LSCSWs, and then they could, that have been licensed over 2 years. I don't know if we could do that now, but they could get a list of LSCSWs and narrow their list down to their area, or go outside of their area if they're going to do televideo supervision.
I had asked another time whether we couldn't start keeping a list of people within each profession that are supervising or have supervised. Whenever you get a completed, licensure application, can we start keeping a list of people who have supervised within those professions? And then that could be a resource for people in that situation.
I know that the Behavior Analyst Certification Board, when you're on their website, when you click, I'm willing to provide supervision, right? And so when you click that, then when somebody goes out there and they look for somebody that's willing to provide supervision to them, then they can contact them directly. I don't know if part of the technology update could be, like a registry where people have the ability to click, yes, I'd be willing to supervise others in my profession.
That would be good. We tried doing this a long time ago and we didn't get a lot of responses, but everything wasn't, now like 90% of our renewals are online. So if we added it to the renewal, they would probably answer that.
That would be a good place to put it, Leslie, right? Like when you're doing your renewal, there's just a checkbox. I'd be willing to provide supervision to others in my discipline.
I like that idea.
That would be great, because otherwise, Leslie, what you were suggesting was pulling a list of everybody who's been licensed for 5 years. And I mean, we're just, oh, I thought you had to be licensed for 5 years to be a supervisor as a social worker.
2.
Maybe that's Missouri.
I think Missouri is 5 years.
Getting states mixed up. Otherwise, people are just calling this long list of individuals that may not even be interested.
Right.
I think, partly what keeps coming up for me in other discussions in other areas are, as a workforce issue, right? And so I think, Cindy, you made some comments earlier, thinking about what that's like from a cost perspective, does that become a barrier to people getting licensed and then being able to work independently at some point? But, it's part of the discussion that we're having everywhere, right? What can we do to improve the ability for licensees to be in the workforce?
So when I think about what we've approved, the board has approved, not us in the office, but the board, there was one university who a couple times has had, their program has a center where they work. And as part of the university standards, I don't know if it's federal or whatever, they are not allowed to go outside of that entity for their supervision. That's really, I mean, there's no other way. So to me, that's an extenuating circumstance. But if the board could provide us clear direction, then, because we've had several lately that, you know, if cost and being in the agency and things like that are not, and I think what Dave is saying is they really don't fall under extenuating circumstances. If we could have a list, or if you want to allow more, then change the reg, but.
And the other disciplines don't worry about this. It's only MFT and professional counseling, because there's no other out for them to request a different supervisor.
Exactly. An LMLP has to have an LCP or an LP, period. And a social worker has to have an LSCSW. And addiction counseling allows outside because they can all practice substance abuse. So, I mean, that's part of the DSM.
I don't think that's what you meant, Leslie.
No,
that we can all practice substance abuse.
No, they can all, substance abuse is part of the DSM, and they are authorized to use the DSM, but they have to have knowledge and practice in that.
Right.
Yeah.
So removing the language removes the problem in one way, and then creates the question of, is that better for workforce? Is that a more limiting for workforce, and the kind of exceptions you're getting asked for? I mean, when I think of the things that have come up, that's really what it ends up being. It's more of that workforce incentive and cost to a licensee.
Yeah. That several of them have talked about their ability to keep their therapist on staff.
Interestingly, in my advisory committee, we didn't think about just removing it. We got sort of stuck on what's extenuating circumstances, and then also, what's going on. What do we believe about our profession in terms of providing supervision? Did that come up for your group, Laura?
It did, and we felt strongly about keeping LPCs in the lane of LCPC supervision.
But if you removed that part, that number 2 or 3 altogether, that eliminates the possibility. Did you guys discuss that?
It's a good point that we had not considered. We didn't go there.
Because it's only subject to our disciplines based on this. And while I hate kicking the can down one more time, I really feel like I need to take that back to my advisory committee and have them say, is this the direction you want to go? This is what the other disciplines have. Or does it warrant this other discussion to look at opening that up?
I think that's the right thing to do, to take it back. And I also am now focused on the other disciplines have already solved for this, and the licensees for these disciplines have understood and solved for this.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah. So I like the idea of taking it back and just running this other option right by them.
Okay. Any other comments before we move into new business?
Thank you.
First item of new business is the appointment of new advisory committee members to the Behavior Analyst Advisory Committee. Linda mentioned earlier, so I'd like to formally note the appointment of Kelly Harrison, Pamela Neidart, Stephanie Willie, and Mike Williams, and to the Marriage and Family Therapy Advisory Committee, Heidi Vella. And I don't need a motion. That's correct, right?
That's correct.
Okay, the next item of business is modification of appointments for the license hearing panels.
And so at the last board meeting, we had noted that there were 2 individuals who had requested hearings on licensing decisions, and board members were tentatively appointed to serve on those hearing panels. When we were able to look at possible dates with those members of the hearing panels, legal counsel, the applicants, BSRB staff, there were some conflicts that we just could not get around. And so I reached out to board members to see if they would be able to serve on certain dates, and we had some changes. And so the board's preference on the hearing panels has been a preference of 5 board members on the hearing panel. And essentially the preference would be that if someone applied for a particular kind of license and there was a board member for that profession, that board member would be one of the members of the hearing panel, that there would be a public member on the hearing panel, and then the remaining 3 could be any board members. So there is a professional counselor hearing coming up, and based on availability, I have 5 board members that could serve on that date. So just wanted to, Mary, see if you'd be willing to appoint that change in who would be serving on that panel, and I'll read off their names. For the professional counseling one, that would be David Stevens, Richard Nobles, Mary Jones, Laura Shaughnessy, and Donna Honer Quayle. And so,
Yeah, I'm glad to appoint that. I'm glad to appoint that new composition.
Okay. And then the second date, this was for a master's level social work, based on conflicts and other availability for that date. There were 3 board members that were available to serve on that date. And so that would be Dave Anderson, Andrea Perdomo Morales, and Linda Heitzman Powell. So based on availability, there's not a public member, but there are 3 board members, and there is the board member, one of the board members for that profession. So just kind of wanted to seek the board's approval if that would be sufficient to go ahead and have 3 board members on the hearing panel instead of 5. I think based on availability, we're kind of limited in terms of who can serve on that date, but I want to bring it to your attention before that happened. So
What was the date of that hearing?
So the date of that hearing was, and I tried not to schedule individuals for both dates, but if any board members would want to volunteer, that one is on Thursday, October 12th from 10 a.m. until 1 p.m. Most of the hearings take about 2 hours, but we block 3 hours to allow time for deliberations afterwards. So.
Is there anyone who is now available during that time?
And I assume you prefer an odd number.
We do. I was just going to say the same thing. I could actually, looking at my calendar now, I probably could clear that, but we generally have opted for odd numbers in case there's a discrepancy in our voting.
An odd number is generally preferred. Yeah.
I can do that as well.
So now we have Mary and Laura available for that hearing on the 12th, and that gives us 5 members, Dave.
Okay. Okay. Well,
and I'm happy to appoint those members.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you for doing that. And I will send you the information for that license hearing. Okay.
Okay, great. The next item of business then is information on recent changes for Service Member Civil Relief Act and portability of professional licensures and service members and their spouses. That's a mouthful, but you're going to tell us an easier version of that.
Yeah, and this is actually an item that the attorney for the board, Tim Resner, had brought to my attention, and there have been some recent changes to federal law. So I asked him if he could kind of discuss that topic with you and share some information. In your packet of material, you do have 3 handouts, so you may want to reference them when Tim is talking to this. There is a notification letter to state licensing agencies from the U.S. Department of Justice. Its subject is professional license portability for service members and their spouses. There's also a copy of 50 USCA 4025A. It's just a 1-page copy of that. And then there's a front and back 1-page handout that is from the U.S. Department of Justice Civil Rights Division that talks about portability of professional licenses and certificates for service members and their spouses. So I'll turn it over to Tim, and he can share a little information about those new changes in law.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. It's an interesting law that was passed this past January by Congress. It applies, it's exclusive to military members or their spouses, and it really creates a new path to licensure through portability. I say licensure, but it's not full-blown licensure. It's really akin to, I think, what you see through the interstate compacts that you've started to adopt. It's a practice privilege, I think, is a good way to put it. and it's predicated on the license in someone's home state or another state for that matter. You know, I think one thing that I take away immediately from this is I look at the language regarding the scope of practice. We had House Bill 2066 that Dave has mentioned that was passed in 2021. What that bill did was it eliminated the concept of substantial equivalency that we've had in our state for a very long time. This bill uses similar language to what we have in House Bill 2066. That is a similar scope of practice. You know, I suppose it could be a nebulous term, but it takes away, you know, any ability of the board, I think, to really drill down to whether or not the profession or the license in another state is substantially equivalent. You know, it's sort of a broad spectrum. You know, depending on how congruent, you know, the practice or profession is in another state. You know, my opinion is it sort of robs the board of a little bit of discretion in making that determination. You know, hopefully not an issue with the interstate compacts that are starting to develop and some congruency among the different states, but that's something I think to be aware of. This law does not apply in situations where there is an interstate compact in place. And so I think you maybe have two professions now that, and you're looking at a third where an interstate compact has been adopted. And so it's not something to worry about in the event that you've adopted an interstate compact that provides a path to licensure or to a practice privilege. The bill does define what's a covered license, and you know what it says is that the person has to actively use the license during the preceding 2 years. Now there's a lawsuit that's pending in Texas, the Western District, U.S. District Court of Texas, and the court in that case construed, because that was one of the arguments, that case involves a school counselor who's moved to Texas, and they're trying to take advantage of this bill. And the Texas, essentially their Board of Education has opposed it. And one of their big concerns is that the person received an Ohio license in July of 2021, and she had a year and about 3 months worth of experience practicing. Texas has a 2-year threshold requirement. You know, this bill says 2 years. So Texas argued actively using means that it has to be continuous. The court disagreed. And I would expect this case to be appealed, but the court disagreed and said essentially that what the bill contemplates is that you've just practiced, not continuously for 2 years, but you practiced within the 2 preceding years. So I mean, I suppose if you take it down to its logical conclusion or redundancy, whichever, you could practice for 1 day and technically qualify under this bill. Some threshold things that you should be interested in is that the person has to be in good standing in their home state. Not necessarily defined, but at the very least, you would think that somebody who's suspended is not in good standing. Probation, that could be questionable as to whether or not that qualifies as good standing. But the bill is very simple in its terms, and so whether or not there will be some guidance that comes out in the future, it's something to pay attention to. That's a requirement. The person then is also required to submit to the jurisdiction of the board. While it's not full-blown licensure, they're going to be required to comply with the standards of practice in our state. If there's a basis for discipline, they're submitting to your disciplinary jurisdiction. And then also with respect to continuing education, they're submitting to those requirements also. Dave and I have spent a little bit of time talking about sort of the application of the bill. One thing that I think is interesting is, currently, I don't believe you have any kind of mechanism to require, the payment of a fee if they want to register for a practice privilege in this state. There will be some administrative expense. If you would have a disciplinary issue, that would require your team to investigate, go to hearing, And, there'll be some expense there to verify CE if you audit someone. Certainly to do some kind of a background check also. Those are things that, will take time at the very least. And I don't think, under any of the statutes that you would have the ability to impose any kind of a fee. So, I suppose if that's something you're interested in, if, what the scope of applicants that are going to try to take advantage of this bill may be limited, so it could be a non-issue, but something to consider, I think, moving forward. And the last thing I wanted to mention regarding this lawsuit that's been filed, the court did here recently grant a preliminary injunction in favor of the applicant, meaning that Texas cannot deny her ability to take advantage of this practice privilege in the state. The applicant has moved for a permanent injunction, which you would think likely will be granted. That's typically what happens when there's a preliminary injunction that's granted, because the court does view the case in total, and one of the elements there is success on the merits, and so that weighs in favor of a permanent injunction ultimately being granted in favor of the applicant. That there likely will be a decision on that in the next couple months. I then would expect the case probably to be appealed to the Circuit Court of Appeals, because Texas did raise some pretty weighty defenses that implicate their state sovereign immunity. You think about this is a little bit different than your interstate compacts, where you have a bunch of different states and their legislatures agreeing to a set of rules. In this case, this is something that came from Congress and it's imposed on states. And so that I think is a weighty issue to be considered. I would expect Texas to appeal there. They also made a preemption argument that there's no difference between the state requirements, and it really comes down to the 2-year practice requirement that Texas disagreed with the feds on. That could be something that's fleshed out too, is what is actively used being within the preceding 2 years. And then they also raise, I think, kind of a novel issue, that is that, if you grant someone a license, there's typically a property interest that comes along with that license. Texas argued that there's no property interest in this case and a practice privilege in Texas because the license at issue is in Ohio, a completely different state, which is an interesting argument, and it could gain some traction on appeal, or it just could be dismissed as out of left field and doesn't have any legal type of basis to it. So that's kind of an overview. I don't know if there are any questions. It's something that's very interesting, and this memo that Dave provided you is sort of matriculated. It's supposed to go out to all licensing boards, and it doesn't appear that they sent it to many in our state. This actually came from the veterinary board, is how we learned of it.
So do I understand that people that are taking advantage of this practice privilege, they're not actually being licensed in Kansas? They're receiving this privilege under this new law. It's really kind of a federally mandated privilege to practice and under our rules while they're here, but they don't have to have any equivalency to our licensing standards. Is that
Yes,
correct?
yeah, I think that's right. It uses the term similar scope of practice. It's not substantial equivalency, but it's, what that is. It could definitely be different depending on where they come from and what those requirements are.
Okay, thank you.
I have
Can I
a
take-
question.
Go ahead, Leslie.
So if we can review a complaint, what would we be disciplining? The person? We can't discipline their Ohio license, correct?
Right. Yeah. It's a very simple bill. It's, if you look at your interstate compacts, there is a mechanism that provides for just that. And I think they say that you can't discipline their home state license, only you can take action with respect to their practice privilege. The result would have to be the same.
Okay.
You get into some conflicting, I think, authorities, but what likely I think would happen as a practical matter, and CPAs in our state, they do have, within statute here in Kansas, they do have a practice privilege. It's something that CPAs have had for 10 or 15 years. And actually, as a matter of statute, Kansas has the ability to discipline a practice privilege, and impose different types of sanctions, and the extent of, I think, what you could do is a question. But at the very least, if you discipline someone here, you're reporting it, and the home state will become aware of it, and they may just take reciprocal action as a result.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think there's a few challenges for us to kind of work through, because this is not something that sort of matches our licensing system. And so as a public protection agency, one of the ways that we ensure the public is protected is by having a verification portal. So someone can go to our website and look to see, are they licensed in Kansas? And if somebody's practicing under a compact authority, we can point them in the direction of usually the compact website, and they can use a portal on that website to verify that they're practicing under the SIPAC commission. Or when the professional counseling compact is all set up, I'm sure there will be some way to verify that they have obtained the privilege to practice by going through the professional counseling compact. With this, I'm not sure how we would provide notice to the public that somebody was practicing in Kansas. Perhaps some sort of a registry, but I don't know that we would have authority to really compel them to be a part of that registry. So that was one of the questions that I was kind of thinking through. And Tim, I thought what you said interesting about the property interest was interesting too, because a lot of those procedural rights seem to attach to, they've paid a fee, or they have a tangible license. And with this, it really isn't even a license. It's just a portability privilege that we're not offering. And at least currently we're not offering. They just are able to do it through having the license in another jurisdiction. So there's some interesting things to work through, but I wanted to make sure that this was brought to the board. And Tim, I thought you did an excellent job going through and walking through sort of the strangeness of this law, and also that states are kind of trying to wrestle with it and implement it. And if I remember right, Tim, I think we talked, if individuals want to still pursue licensure in Kansas, if they're a military member, they still have the right to pursue a license just like they would normally. This just provides a different pathway for them if they want to pursue something under this. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. I think the concern, just as a matter of policy, is that depending on how often you're moving, the number of licenses you have to apply for, and then sort of the administrative burden of tracking your continuing education, which could be different across jurisdictions, and the fee that comes with it. So, I mean, that's the intent of it. I think it's more of an issue for you, Dave, and your team, that you have to figure out exactly how to deal with it, because it's a different animal.
But wouldn't number 3, where it says submits to the authority of the licensing authority in the new jurisdiction, address some of those concerns? Because if we have the ability, just coming back to what you were talking about, Dave, that like the authority to have a registry, if they have the authority to practice in our state, all of us are listed on the BSRB website. So we could list them on the BSRB website just the same. And we could even put in parentheses by authority of blah, 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 whatever this is, to practice in the state. And then that just signifies to the public that this person has authority to practice in the state of Kansas based on this federal regulation. But they're listed on there. And then we could also list them if anybody reports them for bad conduct, we could put them on our, so it seems to me that some of the language that's in here can be interpreted to be that we can incorporate these individuals into our current system.
I think that there's a way for us to start to adapt some of this. I mean, there's some things to work through. For example, we have a pretty defined 2-year license period. And there are some states that have a 1-year license period. I think there's some that have a 3-year license period. And so we could list them, but we really wouldn't know how long they were continuing to have an active license, because they're not going to report that to us. They have to report the first time, but then it's up to them and their home jurisdiction in terms of, if they're keeping that license active, if not. And so when those people eventually stop practicing, I'm curious how we will know that they don't have an active license anymore. So this is probably not a huge number of individuals, but the number could continue to grow. There's just some things that aren't probably specified in the legislation that for us to really work through, we'll have to talk to some states maybe that are also wrestling with these same things. And then, but since this is something that the board could be asked questions about, and it deals with military members, and that's always a really important category of individuals who want to help, just thought it would be a timely item to bring to your attention. So
wouldn't our state have a responsibility to inquire or to check on their license? Because this whole legislation allows them this practice privilege based on them being licensed in another state. So shouldn't that be part of, they have to notify the state that they're claiming this privilege, right?
yes.
So we'll know where they're licensed, and we should know what the date of their renewal is from whatever that notification is.
And can we charge them a fee?
Can't charge them a fee. Yeah, I mean, you're limited by statute as far as what you can charge and not currently. I mean, you would need and maybe that's something you pursue in the future. Because I don't think this is going to go away. I mean, it passed pretty easily through Congress, and I think it's a strong, there's a strong policy behind it, and so it's not going to go away. So that could be something you do. And then, I mean, Dave, we've talked a little bit about developing some kind of an application where, the applicant would agree to certain things similar to what's laid out here in the law. And Cynthia, to your point, that could be something that, that you require them, when they go to renew, because there will be an end date on their home state license. So when they go to renew, they're required to re-register, whatever you want to call this interesting practice privilege.
And also to Cynthia's point too, if it's incumbent upon the state of Kansas to verify their license in the other state, that requires manpower and man hours, which then comes back to that fee, right? So, yeah.
Thank you, Tim. I think this is really important discussion. Again, it goes back to the things we're just seeing across the nation and how we need to look at potential language changes or administration of something like this, because there's a lot of moving parts. We don't even have all the necessary written things in our statutes to really make this a way for us to handle it, really. So I think the board will have to continue to talk about what we do to make sure that we can comply. Any other comments from you, David?
No, just wanted to bring it to your attention now, and I'll give you an update when we continue to work through these things.
Yeah, I'm looking at the time too and being mindful of still having a few agenda items to go through. The next one is draft regulation language on expedited license review process.
Yeah, and so at the last meeting, we had a conversation about conceptually what language we could put into place for a regulation to develop an expedited license or application review process. And as a reminder, this is something that the board had not discussed last year. This was something that the legislature added when the bill went through the process, and there was language that was added it was just brief language that really talked about the board would need to create in rules and regulations an expedited application review process for any license under the BSRB. And then it kind of gave some idea about the cost. I think military members and military spouses were excluded from the cost, but it allowed the board to charge a fee for this. But ultimately, the design of it was not something where we were looking to another state that has a program like this to say we should bring this to Kansas. It was something that was somewhat novel or without precedent. And so we have tried to tackle this in our office. And last meeting, we brought to the board some of the issues with an expedited license application process, such as there are certain cases that require additional investigation because of someone, you know, maybe not meriting the public trust or past felony convictions. There are people who attend schools that are not accredited by their national accrediting bodies. There are individuals who don't submit things in a timely manner. There's also individuals who apply for initial applications where they would need to be approved to take licensing examination, which opens up a window of a couple of years for them to schedule the test and pass the test. So that's a decision. And then there's the reciprocity applicants, which in theory, if we get all the information, we can make a decision as long as there's not those red flags. References are also another issue. So Leslie and I were trying to look at language that perhaps we could use for all the professions. But the problem is there's not general regulations for the board statutes. There are regulations specific to each profession. And so in working through these, we think there probably needs to be a separate regulation that is similar for each of the professions. And then in even working through that, we tried to have language that was the same for initial applications and reciprocity, but the language probably needs to be different for both of those two items. And at the last meeting, we talked about sort of having preamble language basically in the application that says, if you have any of these characteristics or these qualifications, you would not qualify for an expedited license. And so putting that into regulation language has been really challenging. So we do have very brief language that Leslie can share, but I just want to let you know this needs to be worked on quite a bit more. And we know that there needs to be a lot of things added to this. And there have been a number of things that we've been juggling in the office, and we've been trying to work on this as well, but we know this will require additional time. And so Leslie, if you want to share that draft version that we were talking about, and then that might be helpful. And if you're having trouble sharing, let me know.
I think I got it.
Okay.
Can you see it?
Yes. Mhm.
Okay. Okay, so I was working on the intro and because it's so different, it doesn't really work with our, so it would be this is for marriage and family therapy or clinical marriage and family therapy. For each expedited application, the following must be met. The board must receive the following documents for the expedited application process. All required application forms. And we've been discussing whether we need to include like the references and what those references need to be and stuff like that. An official transcript sent directly from each academic institution covering all applicable graduate, college, or university coursework. The full payment of the licensure application fee, the full payment of the expedited application fee, and that the applicant shall have graduated from a program accredited by the Commission on Accreditation for Marriage and Family Therapy Education. Because if they haven't graduated from a school that's professionally accredited, that way there's no way it can be done in 15 days. And then each applicant for clinical, it's the same, except if they're already licensed in Kansas, they don't have to provide the transcript again. And then following that is that things that apply to either marriage and family therapy or clinical marriage and family therapy, we can't provide judgment until we have a complete application. And once they've been approved, once everything's been reviewed and a determination that they've met the educational requirements, they have to pass the appropriate national exam. And once that is done, they're notified that they have to pay the original licensure fee. And that if any of the conditions found in KSA 656408 applies to the applicant cannot apply for the expedited application process. And that statute is the statute that says we can deny, limit, suspend, revoke, etc. for the following things. So it includes the felony, misdemeanor, crime against person, and unprofessional conduct, things like that. And then I have not put in any reciprocity language. Because then you get into similar scope of practice or.
Right. And we've talked about maybe having a definition of an incomplete application as well, or I suppose a complete application, because that's going to be something that questions will arise about as well. So so we are in the process. We've talked a few times about this since the last board meeting. Should have hopefully something a little bit more concrete for you at the out of town board meeting, or potentially the November board meeting based on different items on the agenda. But just kind of wanted to give you an update today, let you know about, as we've actually tried to put those ideas into language, what some of the questions we have come up with and some of the complications, but it is moving forward. It's just, it's very tricky to write a new regulation from scratch. We have talked about the placement should go basically following the application regulation. So there is a logical spot for it to go. But in terms of all these specific requirements in the new language, that's something we're still kind of working through.
Okay, thank you. We'll hear more about that then at our next meeting.
Okay.
We have a discussion for the RFP for the impaired provider meeting or provider program.
Yes, and Leslie, you can stop sharing your screen.
Sorry.
Okay, so one of the items that the board has talked about in the past as something that could be pursued is to set up what's called an impaired provider program. And for some of the board members who are new, essentially there are some other agencies, and this is also something that other states utilize sometimes as well. But it is there's two types of programs. One would be it allows licensing agencies to have a working relationship with a group that can provide substance use disorder evaluations or mental health evaluations or tracking. And what some states use a program like this for is when they have a complaint against a practitioner, and in investigating that, they find that there is also evidence of a substance use disorder or mental health issues. There are resources they can connect that person to, or it can be an alternative to some of the disciplinary remedies. That is one type of a system. Another type of a system would be a more robust system where a certain amount would be paid for available services with a provider. And essentially what would happen under a system like that is that licensees would be able to seek treatment under a type of program like that. Usually it seems like some of the agencies that have a program like that, they pay a certain amount regardless of how many people sign up for it. And then when individuals want to seek services, they can do so. There are questions about whether those individuals would need to report to the BSRB when they're seeking services, because there is unprofessional conduct regulation language that says it would be a violation of unprofessional conduct to continue to practice if you had basically impairments that were affecting your ability to provide services in an appropriate way. And so for individuals to be able to, seek services and continue to practice, it creates some different topics, issues. There's also the question of who should pay for a system like that, if that is something that the board would be interested in, because some of the documentation I have seen is that some of those types of programs are paid, at least in part, by associations in support of the licensees. The question is kind of our role as a licensing body. And so from time to time, the Complaint Review Committee for the board has seen some situations where a licensee, there is evidence of substance use, and there is a question of that person's fitness for practice or things along that manner. And so at the last board meeting, we brought up the impaired provider discussion again. I mentioned that this would be a new program because to my knowledge, the BSRB has never utilized a program like that. And so I asked if board members wanted to volunteer to have more of a discussion on that and look at possible language. So I reached out to the Office of Procurement to see if they could provide any draft RFPs. I have not received anything like that from procurement yet, but another small agency was able to provide me a copy of the agreement that they have. And so we were taking a look at some of that language, but I did meet with Mary Jones and Cynthia Schindel, who both volunteered to have a discussion and help me out with that process. And so it sounds like, based on the limited budget of the BSRB and also our role as a licensing agency, the preference may be to pursue some language for an RFP for that first model that would allow for some alternatives or tools for disciplinary purposes for impaired providers. And this would also give us an opportunity to get more of an idea of how many people that this could impact. Knowing that we may not know how many people would voluntarily seek services if they were available. But in terms of our role as a licensing board, this would be a helpful tool for the complaint review committee. So, and Mary and Cynthia, if you want to add anything to the discussion here, just based on my conversation with both of you, it sounded like that first model was maybe more of what would be helpful for the board at this point, and then try to collect more information and talk to some other states in further detail about how their programs work.
Yeah, I would like to have some idea of the numbers of complaints that end up involving some kind of substance abuse, so we have some sense of the scope of the problem. And but also that first model, my memory from our discussion was that it primarily would be used for disciplinary purposes, and so that doesn't allow for what a lot of impaired provider programs are about, which is providing a safe space for people to voluntarily seek treatment before it gets to the point where there's a complaint against them. But I mean, it's a place to start, I guess.
Yeah, I think one of the things to weigh with a larger program is two agencies that I know that utilize an impaired provider program are the Board of Nursing and the Board of Pharmacy, and those individuals have much more access to pharmaceuticals. I do, from what I have heard, just in general terms, it sounds like both programs are fairly pricey. So in terms of it being a new program, the cost factor, and without knowing how many people would sign up for it or what those entities could charge, there's some big questions to ask. If it's a fairly limited one that's kind of based on more of tools for disciplinary matters, that seems to be something that I could target right now while we continue to research this topic.
Yeah, thank you, David. I think that's a good place to start for us. I appreciate your work on that. Again, we're at 5 minutes left, and we wanted to discuss the offsite planning meeting and some potential agenda items there.
And Mary, would you like me just to kind of?
Sure, go.
Yeah. Okay. So this is definitely not a comprehensive list of all the items that can be covered at the offsite planning meeting, but just as a reminder, that offsite planning meeting is on Monday, October 23rd, 2023. Probably in the next week or so, I'll be reaching out to board members to get confirmations on which board members need a hotel room the night before. And so I'll be reaching out to you to let you know. But in talking with Mary to finalize the agenda for this board meeting, she thought it would be helpful to kind of have a few items to get board members thinking about. And I thought that was a great idea. So this is just kind of to help you start to think about these things, to bring in ideas and be ready to discuss at that offsite planning meeting. And one of the items is the unprofessional conduct regulations. Those have been discussed over the last 2 years, and there's been a lot of really good conversation about them. The most recent development was that the combined proposed changes were forwarded back to the advisory committees. Each of the advisory committees will have one more opportunity to meet before the board's offsite planning meeting. So hopefully the idea would be that at that meeting, the board would have an opportunity to kind of make recommendations on what should be put forward for proposed changes to unprofessional conduct regulations. So if you could be thinking about finishing your work on that at your advisory committee meeting in October, and then as a board, making a decision in terms of what you want to be forwarded for professional conduct regulation changes, that would be good. And then the second one had to do with the time frame for individuals accruing hours towards a clinical license. We talked about the recent change from 4,000 hours down to 3,000 hours, and the language that was in regulation that talked about that they should be done in no fewer than 2 years. But if you're decreasing that by 25% from 4,000 to 3,000, if you want to maintain the same ratio, it might make sense to go ahead and lower that from 2 years to 18 months. So that was something to be thinking about as well. And then the next topic had to do with there is a certain regulation that talks about for every 15 hours of direct client contact for individuals pursuing a clinical license, they need to get 1 hour of supervision. And so that topic is one that I think should get a little bit of discussion to see if that is posing any issues or if that is something that should be potentially changed. And so, and then if there were any other topics, I'll probably meet with Mary maybe a week or so before that offsite planning meeting to finalize the agenda, but wanted to give you an opportunity if there were other items you thought would be helpful to discuss. Linda, I know that there was that behavior analyst topic that you wanted the board's support on in terms of having behavior analyst added to that item. If there were any other items, feel free to let me know even after the meeting, but if you had something today, that's something that potentially we could add to the list right now for Mary and I to discuss. If there's too many items, there is still a board meeting planned in November, so there are other opportunities. So.
Okay, well, feel free to send those over to David if you do have something between now and then that we can look at. But I'm hoping we can close the loop on some of the discussions we've had at that offsite planning meeting as well. Okay, well, if there are no other issues or topics for today's meeting, then it looks like it's time for a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
Thank you. Thank you. All those in favor?
Aye.
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 Thank you all. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.